Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is September the 11th, 2022, and we are here to talk about the world. The person I'm going to be joining in voice is a friend of mine. We used to have long conversations like this back in college, and we continue this tradition here on Twitch, talking about what the heck is going on. Without further ado, we begin the discussion with Agent Smith. Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Oh. I thought you wanted to start at 9.
Is it 8 there? God, I'm so bamboozled with time zones. Am I not late?
No.
It's 8 there?
Yeah, it's 8 o'clock now.
Okay, good. I was like feeling bad. I was like, man, I told him to be ready at this time, and then he just had to wait an hour. I should have told him the other time. I mixed it up. I just went to Florida for a trip, so my sense of where I am in time zone was a little bit discombobulated. But we started at the correct time for what I initially texted you. Good.
Yeah, it's all good.
Sweet. Well, Chad is pretty hyped to talk with you. I have a personal update from Bitter Sugar. I just checked in with him randomly. I hadn't seen him in Twitch chat for a bit, and I was still a bit worried about him. And it turns out he got banned for 30 days on Twitch for getting into a heated discussion with someone who was pushing some of that like pro-war Russian propaganda. So it's a good reason to get a suspension, I think. Standing up for himself. And he's fine. They said a lot of stuff is kind of getting back to normal, and there was a major counteroffensive recently that Ukraine launched, and he gave me a map, which I will send to you in Discord, of the angles of their attack. The cities and stuff are in Cyrillic, so I don't know what exactly all of them are, but you could probably guess by the bodies of water and such where this is, and you've probably seen some other maps. But yeah, he's doing well. Sure. Their morale is pretty good. Apparently they were talking in the news about wanting to retake Kherson or doing something there, and then they ended up moving somewhere else entirely. So what's the story there? Have you followed all that?
Yeah. It's so for a long time, for the past couple months, the government and the media had been making noises about an offensive in the south, in Kherson Oblast. And, there were little things going on here and there, but it didn't seem like a big offensive was going to happen. But then a couple weeks ago, they actually started to make some significant movements. It still wasn't anything nearly as major as, say, what the Russians did, like at the start of the war. No big, grand movements of large units or anything like that. But it was clear that they were applying more pressure in Kherson. And they were making little advances, like here and there at different parts of the front. Again, nothing too dramatic, but, they were clearly trying to do something. So then, in the past couple days, thereabouts, there was a big offensive launched in Kharkiv, in the northeast of Ukraine. Around Kharkiv. Around the Kharkiv city, in Kharkiv Oblast. And that actually made pretty significant headway. That was an offensive launched east towards the city of Izium. And the purpose of that was to try to cut off certain Russian forces in Donbass from some of their supply chain anyway. A lot of the territory that Russia took in the initial phase of their Donbass offensive over the summer was taken as a result of pushing simultaneously north from south, but also south from the northern area, not too far from Kharkiv. And one of their primary axes of advance was north-south towards and beyond Izium. And so the highway that runs through Izium was one of the main supply arteries for Russian forces moving south from along that axis. And so what the Ukrainians are doing now is they're basically bypassing, all of the Russian forces south of Izium, and they're just pushing directly on the city so that they can cut off Russian forces to the south from supplies moving south along the highway. They can still get some supplies from the east and probably also the south, but it'll be a little more fraught because coming from the east, they have to move stuff across a bridge, which is a natural choke point, so the Ukrainians will be able to target that relatively easily. South should be a little bit easier, but they would have still been able to get more supplies in if they still had that Izium highway. I think as is, in the past day or two, the Russians actually lost Izium. And they've also lost a number of other, towns and cities that the Russians had previously taken. Uh, I think from what I've been reading from, people who actually are experts in the subject matter, they say that it seems like the Russians were surprised by the offensive in Kharkiv. It seems like they shifted their weight, militarily speaking, to what I just said, the Kherson Oblast, because they thought that there would be some major action there, and they wanted to shore up their defenses there to defend against a possible Ukrainian offensive. So that kind of makes it sound like the Ukrainians maybe just distracted the Russians by making them think there was going to be an offensive in Kherson, when really they were planning something out of Kharkiv. But one guy I was reading on Twitter was saying that that's probably not the case. They're probably just two separate offensives that were staggered in order to try to get the Russians off weight. But that doesn't mean, so Kherson is not a distraction per se. It is a genuine offensive in its own right. But it may not be like the main axis of advance that was planned for this set of offensives here. This is actually something the Russians did a lot in World War II. Not that that's entirely relevant here anymore. Obviously, a lot of time has passed since then, and the Ukrainians in particular have more of a Western-trained army at this point than a Soviet one. But, there were several points in World War II in the Eastern Front when the Soviets would stagger their offensives. They would have multiple axes of advance in a given offensive, but they wouldn't launch them all at the same time. They would launch one in one area, and then they would wait a day or two, and then they would launch the second one along a different axis of advance, and then they would advance, and then on a couple days after that, they would advance along the third axis of advance. So that sort of threw the Germans off balance, because they would, of course, react to the initial advance and distribute their reserves towards that threat. But then they would be off balance when the next axes of advance started. So they would have to scramble to move forces. So basically, it's just a way of confusing your opponent. It forces them to react. Either it forces them to overreact to the initial advance and then not have reserves available for the others, or it forces them to be overly cautious with contributing their reserves because they don't know if there's going to be further advances along other axes that they have to defend against. So it's something that has been seen before, at least in the region as far as conflict. So the Ukrainians seem to be doing something like that, and it seems to be working. They haven't made much advance in Kherson, but they've made surprisingly good advances in Kharkiv, or south of Kharkiv, anyway.
I have the live UA map up here, but it's in Cyrillic, so it's hard to tell exactly where we're talking about here, but I see a bunch of blue up in the north and the east. Is that where you're talking about the major gains were made?
Well, it depends on the map. I'm not sure what the blue would represent. Oh, I see.
Live UA map, yeah, up here.
Can you zoom in there?
Yeah.
Got a couple seconds delay.
Yeah, so this is Kharkiv up here.
Chuikov. It could be it. I know.
Yeah, there's Izium there. It says Zelensky hails troops who liberated a key east city of Izium.
Yeah.
And then Kherson is down here to the south, right?
Yeah, that's northwest of Crimea.
Yeah.
Yeah, on this map, the blue represents territory that the Russians had held but were pushed out of. So I think that area is the relevant area in question.
Yeah, so they took all of this stuff kind of on the northeastern border.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking about this a little bit in terms of StarCraft and dividing your forces, and how it's really tough for whoever's holding the territory to know, like, what is the distribution of Ukrainian offensive potential on the front. It's hard to tell, like, did they have more in the north or more in the south? They basically would need to prepare everywhere if they're wanting to hold this territory. And if Kherson is being threatened here in the south. They have that fortified, but they don't really know, like, is that the brunt of their troops or is it like 20%? Because even if it is 20%, they do still need enough defenses to hold that territory, and it makes it pretty tricky. But it seems like they really got a major breakthrough up here in the north.
Yeah, they made significant advances there.
Mm-hmm.
Took significant ground, rather. Let me put it like that. So it's been a pleasant surprise.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't clear that the Ukrainians would have the necessary manpower to launch offensives that could really break through Russian defenses, because the Russians have basically been fortifying the positions that they've taken, you know, thus far, in preparation for a potential counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. And it was thought that while the Russians may struggle on the offense, that, you know, they would probably do better on the defense, because that doesn't require, you know, a lot of complicated maneuver or warfare. You can pretty much just sit in place and rely on fixed defensive positions. But it seems like the Russians are kind of illustrating some of the deeper problems that they've been experiencing, and that we've kind of talked about before. You know, problems with manpower, problems with logistics, problems with leadership. Manpower in particular is something that I've seen talked about online a lot. In particular, you know, a lack of mobilization on the part of the Russian government has meant that they've increasingly had to depend on sort of weirder and more desperate sources of manpower to replenish their losses in Ukraine. So there's been more reports of Syrian mercenaries. There's been a lot of conscription in the separatist republics in eastern Ukraine. The Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. You know, before they had been drafting some people, but now it's like the local governments there are trying to mass mobilize to get every man they can that's available into the army. And it seems like the separatists, republics, and their troops that they're mobilizing are sort of the main source of replenish new troops, basically, for the Russian army thus far. They're also recruiting more heavily in Russia, trying to pay people basically more money as a reward for signing up. Also, they've been trying to get people who are retired military to try to come back in exchange for a higher pension and other rewards. So part of that lack of manpower manifests as brittle positions, for one, because they can't just be strong everywhere, right? That's Sun Tzu's old maxim, you know, if you try to be strong everywhere, you're going to be weak everywhere.
Yep.
But then another problem is that a lot of the troops that they're kind of relying on more now, you know, the recent conscripts, especially those from Donetsk and Lugansk, are not well motivated because they're being forced to fight. And a lot of them have no desire to, especially given just what a meat grinder it's been over there. So the result is not only that they don't have strong positions, but also that the troops defending those positions are extremely unmotivated, to the point where there are a lot of rumors about people just walking away. You know, when they come under attack, they just leave or surrender or what have you. So that's probably, in so much as it's true anyway, part of the reason that the Russian lines have fallen back so much. It's probably the case that troops in those areas were not top-notch units, you know, in so much as the Russians have those anymore. The best units they had were probably either redeployed to Kherson or were resting and refitting in the rear after the end of the recent Donbass offensive this summer. So probably the units they had up in and around Kharkiv were not top-notch. They were probably just second or third tier units consisting of conscripts and whatever else they could scrap together. And when they came under pressure, basically they just folded. Like, they had no desire to, you know, go to the mat fighting against the Ukrainian army. So that's possible. That's something that I've seen talked about, but it's also hard to prove. You know, we don't have a lot of direct evidence. But given manpower shortages and logistical difficulties, that's entirely possible. You know, I find it believable, at least at this point.
Yeah.
So a combination of strategic misdirection and tactical prowess, or perhaps, you know, tactical insufficiency on the part of the Russians defending the area, are principally responsible for recent gains on the part of the Ukrainians.
Yeah, you mentioned Sun Tzu. Another thing that he talks about is the moral factor, which is the relationship between command and the people who are there fighting, and how, like, making them feel like they have a chance to win and that they're fighting for a good cause ends up just boosting the effectiveness of all the units that you have. But it's really difficult to measure that, like how excited are the troops on either side to fight. Logically, you would assume that the Ukrainian locals have a lot more of an incentive to fight than people who are being brought in from another country and told that we are now going to conquer this. That's not quite as intense of a call to action as your home is being taken away from you and like your city is being razed. That's a pretty different feel to it. So I would guess that just over time, the burnout of like, do I still want to keep fighting? It would hit the Ukrainians later than it would hit the invaders, just because of like that moral factor of you have a good cause, and over time that just means you're going to consistently be willing to do whatever it takes.
Yeah, that's been a problem for the separatists from the start. You know, both the Russian government and separatist radicals in eastern Ukraine were very hopeful after Euromaidan that there would be a lot of support to separate eastern Ukraine from Ukraine and have it, you know, join Russia or at least become independent. But they were pretty disappointed overall. You know, they were hoping for an uprising, and at most they got, you know, some guerrillas, some hidden raid attacks, you know, that kind of stuff. It wasn't nearly enough, really, to separate eastern Ukraine like they wanted. And that's why, in part, anyway, the Russian army had to be sent in. You know, the separatists just didn't have enough support or enough strength to do it themselves. And, you know, even now, even, you know, among people that might nominally sympathize with Russia, they're not sympathetic enough to want to go and fight and die for it. You know, they're pretty passive overall. And that's kind of true in the case of pretty much any civil war or, you know, even just conventional conflicts generally. Most people are not that interested. Generally, it's the radicals of one kind or another who are the most gung-ho to fight. So that's meant it's been difficult for the separatist republics to build legitimacy amongst the local population, for one, but then also to try to mobilize those people to actually fight to maintain what independence they've gotten thus far. You know, the willpower, the willingness amongst the general population in the separatist republics to actually do that seems to be severely wanting.
There was some stuff about people being upset with Putin and having resistance within the Russian government. Have you seen anything about that?
Well, I've seen that there's been some infighting between Prigozhin and the mayor of St. Petersburg. And there's been some other maneuverings and whatnot, but that had already been going on. I think probably people are talking more about some of the negative reporting in Russian media about the recent setbacks in Ukraine. You know, normally they don't do that, but more recently, in response to the Kharkiv offensive in particular, a lot of Russian media came out very pessimistic and were almost complaining. Can't really completely complain, but they did come out and note that there had been problems on the front. So I think Kadyrov and Chechnya in particular kind of came out and said explicitly that it made him question Russia's leadership. Kadyrov is the president of Chechnya. He's sort of the semi-autonomous head of Chechnya. They have a special arrangement there wherein basically he runs Chechnya like his personal kingdom, but in exchange he has to maintain fealty to Moscow. But of course, if Moscow is not strong enough to coerce, or at least deter, Chechnya from fighting again for independence, Kadyrov might be tempted. He may make a break for it. Russian army isn't exactly making a great accounting of itself right now. So it's within the realm of possibility that he might. It remains to be seen.
Why is St. Petersburg one of the places that's complaining?
It's not complaining, really. It's not like the people there elected a guy who was, you know, more liberal and doesn't like the government. It's more just elite infighting. So, you know, the mayor of St. Petersburg and Prigozhin are all part of the same extended patronage network with Putin on top. But among those people in the network, there's always jockeying for position, right? You know, you always want somebody else's position for yourself, or at least for people you control, so that you can have more power within the network. So they take the opportunity, not infrequently, to try to go after each other. Generally it's very subdued because nobody wants to rock the boat too much, because then, the head of the patronage network may get upset with you and may kick you out. And that would be a problem since that's your main source of income. But in circumstances like the present, where there's a lot of instability and unpredictability as far as what's going to happen with the war, the government's legitimacy, the Russian economy, that creates new opportunities. That basically creates more risk, but also more opportunity that people are willing to kind of go after in order to take advantage and maybe, possibly, make significant gains in terms of their personal influence within the patronage network. So that's always the case. It's just becoming more pronounced more recently as the government looks more shaky. That may or may not escalate depending on how the war goes and whatever is happening within, the confines, within the power elite, so to speak. It's impossible to tell what they're really thinking because it's an opaque political system. So this may be just routine jockeying for power that's just a little unusual in how brazen it is, or this could betray some kind of underlying cracks in the coalition governing Russia right now that could widen with time. Difficult to say, so something to watch.
Yeah, in any case, starting a war and then losing it doesn't really look too good.
No, it does not.
And with the major losses, you would expect there to be more questions raised and more people who are doubting a lot of the propaganda and stuff that's been going around of this is going to be an easy walkover win for them and we're actually doing really well. Like, word does get out eventually. They're like, oh shit, they just lost a whole bunch of territory. Like, what's going on? Whose fault is it? And we talked some in previous segments about how there are a lot of systemic issues regarding corruption in the military, and that's one of those things where as money is being passed around, they say, okay, here's like $200 million, make this many tanks of whatever kind it is. And if you just pocket a couple mil here and there for yourself, like that's something that's going to go relatively unnoticed until you get into a big scale conflict like this. And it turns out that maybe your equipment isn't as well managed as it could be, and maybe your logistical network, it has some different scuffed aspects to it because you didn't really put all of that money where it was meant to go.
Yeah, exactly. You need to maintain resources in storage, or even even just standing forces in the field so that they're ready for a conflict. But when you have massive corruption, they'll take advantage of your lack of attention to those areas, since people, even governments really pay more attention to the military in wartime than in peacetime, just because in wartime you have something to measure efficacy and effectiveness with, that being success on the battlefield. But in peacetime, it's kind of harder to do that, and so that creates more room for corruption. So it's just easier to hide a lack of capability and a lack of preparation in peacetime. And so corrupt actors take advantage of that, and you just don't see the consequences of that until you actually do find yourself in a conflict, at which point it becomes readily apparent, frequently at very high cost.
Someone in the chat asking for a brief explanation of Euromaidan. So the protests in 2013 in Ukraine.
A brief explanation of one of the most controversial and complicated political events in 2010's Europe. Sure, why not? I can take a crack at it.
Sure.
I don't know if I can do it in a way that's going to be satisfying to everybody.
Okay, you can go a little bit over brief.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you want to understand Euromaidan, and I'm assuming the person asking, just has zero background knowledge on it and is asking for like something resembling a complete review, albeit a truncated one, so that it's quote unquote quick. In order to really understand it, you have to understand the background, leading up to it. And to understand that, you kind of have to understand the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, which again is complicated and controversial. So it's a little hard to peg down in a way that everybody would agree on. But at the very least, you should know that Ukraine, for a very long time, a couple centuries really, was effectively part of Russia, more specifically the Russian Empire. And I think that you can date that pretty much from I want to say the 1600s is when the Russian Empire expanded there for the first time formally. That was when I think they started with, what was it, left bank Ukraine, which is the eastern part of the country, and then they later on moved on to right bank Ukraine, which is the western part of the country, somewhat confusingly. So that would have been 1600s roughly. So for about 400 years or so, Ukraine was the westernmost province, so to speak, of the Russian Empire. At least until they got Poland, but that's another story. But anyway, they're ethnically distinct peoples. Ukrainians are ethnically Ukrainian, Russians ethnically Russian, but there's a lot of similarities. They're both Slavic, they both sort of emerged in close proximity to each other. They exchanged a lot of ideas. There was a lot of intermarriage. The languages influenced each other. The Russian language, and in particular Russian literature, kind of advanced more quickly than Ukrainian language, to the point where, even today, some people complain, probably more Russian nationalists these days, but, I had heard people complain that there were words in Russia that Ukrainian just did not have equivalents for. And that's just because, Russia developed economically, more quickly. And so they ended up having to develop new words for new ideas, new equipment, new technologies, etc., that were sort of newer to Ukrainian. So the Ukrainian language kind of had to play catch up. And as a result, it was perceived amongst Russians as being less sophisticated. And as a result, there came to be a lot of negative associations between the Ukrainian language and, negative associations made of the Ukrainian people because they were seen as basically bumpkins, sort of a frontier people living in the relatively rural, undeveloped part of the empire. And the sense amongst Russian nationalists for a long time is that the Ukrainians were basically little Russians. I think that was the phrase they used. And that over time, eventually, the little Russians would assimilate into what they would have considered mainstream Russian culture. So they would have adopted Russian language, Russian customs, etc., and would have eventually just become indistinguishable in virtually any way from ethnic Russians. And, that wasn't entirely crazy. You can see that happening in other parts of Europe. We don't really talk about it much or remember it much now because it was so long ago. But originally, in Western Europe, in places like France and England, there used to be multiple languages in different parts of the country. And the governments in those places basically had to go out of their way in order to teach people a single national language and all but force them to speak it, in order to homogenize language across their countries. So I think even as late as the mid-20th century, some relatively large population of France, I want to say like 40% or so, something like that, still spoke a language other than French as their first language. Basically local versions of French, if you like. And it just took a lot of time for state education, to expand such that more and more people had access to it. In order to teach people how to speak French and encourage them to speak only in main French, the main state-backed, basically, form of French. And you can still kind of see this dynamic playing out in other parts of Europe that didn't really get strong centralized states until much later than England and France. So like Germany and Italy, for example, didn't unify and develop strong centralized governments until the late 1800s. And in those cases, the languages... Well, in those countries, even today, there's still a lot of identity around local languages. They've been significantly degraded over time. I think pretty much everybody speaks the sort of state-backed main German or Italian language at this point. But there's relatively more people in Germany and Italy that still speak the old local languages than there are in France and England. Because they're later in, basically they're earlier in that process of homogenizing the national language that everybody is supposed to speak. So Russian nationalists were basically thinking in that vein when they were thinking of assimilating Ukrainians. They thought, okay, this is just a group of Russians who were, just slightly different than us, but who are eventually just going to be assimilated into our mainstream culture by way of state education. It's just a normal organic process that you can see anywhere. So that was their perception. Now, Ukrainian nationalists did not like that, obviously. And the thing is that Ukraine is much larger than any of the local regions in, say, France or Germany that had their own local languages. Ukraine was really the size of a country in and of itself. And in the late 19th century, there was kind of an evolutionary spurt of Ukrainian literature that helped create and harden the Ukrainian identity, an identity that was separate from the Russian identity. And that served as the nucleus around which Ukrainian national identity coalesced over the subsequent decades. And whether that identity is valid or is artificial is kind of an ongoing debate. And you can probably guess how different actors align on that. Russian nationalists still kind of think of them still think of the Ukrainian identity as being an artificial identity. Whereas Ukrainian nationalists, of course, think it's just as genuine an identity as any other in Europe. So without getting into the whole national identity debate, this is basically how these different views break down. And that was important in order to understand how both the late Russian Empire as well as the Soviet Union approached the topic. So, the Russian Empire was very much a assimilating force. They were imperialists. So they wanted everybody to be Russian to one degree or another. And that was a very unpopular position amongst both Ukrainian nationalists, but also Russian leftists. Because, of course, leftists in Russia, like, all over Europe, were almost inherently anti-imperialist. So they wanted to carve out space for ethnic minorities in the empire so that they could live and thrive in their own communities with their own culture intact, without having some overbearing imperial authority try to erase it. So the Soviet Union, when it was created, was, of course, as you can imagine, led by radical leftists. And their approach then to ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union was to give them a lot of autonomy. And as a result, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was created, in which they had nominal autonomy. Of course, the Communist Party controlled everything. But the party's doctrine was such that Ukrainian people were granted effectively their own nation within the Soviet family. And so that helped also to preserve and harden Ukrainian identity, because it de facto, that is to say, the Soviet government de facto recognized that separate identity. Now, it gets even more complicated at this point, because the way I'm describing it may make you think that the Bolsheviks, basically, the Soviet government, recognized a separate Ukrainian identity and respected it. But that's not actually true. They recognized the identity as separate, but they were still influenced by that previous Russian imperial perception of Ukrainians as Little Russians, like basically just pseudo-Russians who were speaking a slightly different dialect and who were less educated and who were going to be incorporated and assimilated into Russian eventually over the long term. And in general, the Soviet leadership believed that's what would happen. But unlike the Russian imperialists under the Tsar, they didn't think they had to force it. They thought they just had to incur enough economic development and build a strong enough state with strong enough education that it would just happen organically, without any kind of suppression of the Ukrainian identity. But they still thought it would disappear over time. So they were still relatively antagonistic. They were just antagonistic to the Ukrainian identity in a much more subtle way. Now, I'll mention here, before I kind of move on to the end of the Cold War, that in the 1950s there was an important event, which was Crimea. Crimea had been a part of Russia. Within the Soviet Union, there were different Soviet socialist republics. Russia was easily the largest one. And then there were the different frontier republics, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, etc., all those. And Crimea had been considered, Russian, because it played an important part in Russian history for a very long time before that. It was a major conquest in the late 1700s by Catherine the Great, and became the center for the projection of Russian military force into the Black Sea region, because of course they built the big port of Sevastopol in southwestern Crimea, which became the main naval base for Russia's Black Sea Fleet. So there was a lot of history there for Russia that made Crimea particularly important to them. But in the 1950s, for some reason, and there's some dispute about exactly why, but for some reason, Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the premier of the Soviet Union, transferred Crimea to Ukraine. As a result, when Ukraine became independent, Crimea was part of Ukraine and not part of Russia, which created a lot of angst, not only amongst Russian nationalists, but also Russian strategists. Because, like I said, that's where their Black Sea Fleet was headquartered. They had a huge naval base there in Sevastopol. And now, after the Soviet Union collapses, it's in another country. That's a problem, obviously. And it's one they really struggled with. Now, as to why Crimea was transferred, I mean, there's a couple different theories. I think one of the sort of urban legend, popular culture explanations is that Nikita Khrushchev did it as a gift. He wanted to gift Crimea to Ukraine. He himself, I think, had some Ukrainian heritage. But also, he didn't really think that there would ever be any issue created by gifting Crimea like this. Because, of course, the Soviet Union is going to last forever, and Ukraine and Russia will always be tied together. So no big deal. So basically just a lateral move there. It wasn't supposed to actually really mean anything. Of course, if that's the case, he was very wrong. But, you can't really blame him for not being able to see half a century into the future. But that's probably not the full story, or maybe even not at all the story. I think the most believable explanation that I've ever read, and again, it's debatable, but there was a lot of problems within the Soviet Union as far as republics organizing and negotiating with each other for issues that were cross-border in nature. The Soviet political system was inherently bureaucratic. Everything took forever and had to be done by committee. And so that made issues that required multiple bureaucracies among multiple republics even more difficult to resolve in anything resembling a timely manner. And one of the issues that Crimea had, and which it still has, is that there's not a lot of fresh water there. A lot of the fresh water that Crimea gets has to be imported from Ukraine. Historically, it's come mostly from Ukraine, and specifically via canal dug connecting the Dnieper River with Crimea. And negotiating transfers of water and water rights and whatnot, that was kind of complicated between the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So this explanation basically posits that in order to simplify the bureaucratic processes involved with dealing with shipping water, well, not shipping, but maintaining Crimea's water supply from Ukraine, they just gave Crimea to Ukraine so that the single Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic government could handle it by itself without having to go and deal with equivalent bureaucratic entities in the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. So that's just speculation, but I find that a lot more believable than a lot of the other stuff I've read thus far. But anyway, Crimea became part of Ukraine at that point. So, skipping ahead, Soviet Union collapses, Ukraine becomes an independent country. This presents a lot of difficult, thorny problems for the Soviet Union. I mean, it would create problems for anybody. Like, imagine your country, like whatever country the people listening are from right now. Just imagine your country and how economically and politically integrated it is, and how interdependent all of the regions of your country are. Now imagine all those different regions of your country break away and become independent states. So now there's borders between regions where there weren't previously borders. Now there has to be intergovernment cooperation on issues where before it was a single government, or where maybe even localities just dealt with it. All of that just creates a duplication of effort, so to speak, administratively speaking. So everything becomes more difficult. Economic activity becomes significantly inhibited because now you have to pay tariffs, cross-border tariffs, where previously it was just free. So all of those problems are what kind of came up and impacted the former Soviet Union. Trade between Ukraine and Russia used to be seamless, in so much as there's trade, in a command economy. But after the Soviet Union collapses, now it's not seamless anymore. And so that means that the very structure of the economies of Russia and Ukraine had to adjust to that. And that itself was a very wrenching process. But it was even worse because it was happening at the same time that the economy was restructuring from a command economy into a market economy. And, that would be a very wrenching process also just by itself. But even that was made worse by the fact that the leadership of Ukraine and Russia did not handle it particularly well. Between advice from Western advisors who may or may not have known what they're doing, and the pressure coming from within the political economy of Russia and Ukraine, from special interests like the heads of industry, former factory managers, unions, groups like that, all of that combined to create some relatively badly designed industrial policies that were intended to protect industry in Ukraine and Russia so that it would survive the transition process, but which in effect had the opposite impact, which was to actually harm them more. That's a whole topic unto itself, but it's important to bring up here just to understand that the economies of Russia and Ukraine immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union were pretty bad. They were in bad shape. Quality of life fell. There was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of urban decay, a lot of corruption, a lot of organized crime. Just bad news. The 90s were very bad news for Russia and Ukraine, and it was a very hard period to live through. Now, one of the things that happened in Russia and Ukraine in the 90s is that there was some divergence to a degree in terms of how they responded. So in the case of Russia, well, in both cases, there were oligarchs that emerged, right? There were people who dominated the commanding heights of the economy. In other words, there were like a handful of people that ended up owning most of the most productive sectors of the economy. And those oligarchs would compete with each other for power. Now, in the case of Russia, over the course of the 90s, there was consolidation. Basically, the power center shifted towards one particular set of oligarchs, principally the ones that were aligned with Boris Yeltsin. And so by the time Vladimir Putin took power, he was able to take that to the next stage and basically dominate and subjugate the rival oligarchs, and in turn dominate Russia's political system, thereby sidelining the oligarchs. Still powerful and influential, but the ones that are aligned with Putin are the most powerful, and really he's dominated them as well. So at this point, oligarchs are, again, an important factor in Russian politics, but they're not nearly as important as some people sometimes make them out to be. They haven't really been dominant figures since really the 90s. Since then, Putin and his entourage, his extended patronage network, are the real power center of Russian politics and have been for a while now. In Ukraine, by contrast, they had the same emergence of oligarchs, but they never had that consolidation. Basically, oligarchs in Ukraine continued competing with each other over the course of the aughts and 2010s as they had in the 90s. And so it created a different political economy where there was not as much authoritarianism per se, because authoritarianism would have given this big advantage to whichever oligarch was in power at the time the government did that. So everybody had an incentive then, as far as oligarchic competition, to try to limit the power of the state. So that helped inadvertently preserve Ukrainian democracy in a way that the Russian people and political system did not benefit from. Now, obviously, oligarchs are not great economically or politically, so there was definitely a cost there. But the inability of a single oligarch to dominate, or of a political elite of some kind, in the vein of Boris Yeltsin or Putin, to dominate the political system, meant that they ended up with a relatively decentralized political system over time, as opposed to Russia's centralized political system. So, going back to the issues that sort of cropped up after the collapse of the Soviet Union, beyond the political evolution of Russia and Ukraine, economically it was a catastrophe. And at first, there was an effort to try to maintain ties between industry in Russia and Ukraine, because there had been considerable ties up till that point. A lot of naval manufacturing. As far as there are a lot of manufacturing relevant to the Russian Navy had happened in Ukraine, and there had been a lot of production of intermediate goods of one sort or another, inputs for other military vehicles in the Russian military. So a lot of that ended up being disrupted, and they were able to maintain some of it, but a lot of it just imploded. And that's part of why Eastern Ukraine in particular was hurt by the collapse of the Soviet Union, because a lot of that industry, which was tied into the Russian economy, was focused in Eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass. Western Ukraine, by contrast, was not nearly as economically integrated with the rest of the Soviet Union, and so they were not impacted as much. Now, that's important to keep in mind because I probably should have explained this before, but eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine have way more ethnic Russians than the rest of Ukraine. And that's because eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine were the first parts of Ukraine to be conquered by Russia in the 1600s. And at that time, it was largely frontier territory. It was sparsely settled, and it was mostly Cossacks of one kind or another, Ukrainian Cossacks generally. And so it was relatively easy then for the Russian government to create incentives that attracted a lot of Russian settlers to settle there. There were even more Russians that moved there when they tried to industrialize the area in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Russian Empire in the case of the 19th century, Soviet Union in the case of the early 20th century. And in both cases, somewhat, this is kind of trivia, but in both cases, there was actually a lot of American engineers that were imported to help develop the area because America was producing a lot of engineers at that time. And so there was some interesting American cameos there during that particular era of Russian history. But anyway, as it industrialized, lots more Russian migrants came in. A lot of Russia's educated population were disproportionately Russian in the 19th century, 20th century. So that's also part of the reason why, the settlers were disproportionately Russian. But over time, the demographics of Ukraine changed as a result. So that area in the east of Ukraine and Donbass attracted a lot of Russians, and so relatively more of the ethnic Russian population in Ukraine is located there. And then also in the south, where the city of Odessa was founded by the Russians to serve as their principal Black Sea port, that also became disproportionately Russian. I think it's majority Russian, if I'm not mistaken. And Crimea, of course, was basically all but purged of its native population. And almost all of most of the population there, I think like 60-70% today, is ethnic Russian. People in chat can correct me on that if I'm wrong. That's off the top of my head. But the rest of Ukraine wasn't conquered until later, and there wasn't as much economic development there after they conquered it, and so that area remained mostly ethnically Ukrainian. To kind of go off on a tangent here, there was actually, from what I've read anyway, there was some overpopulation in Ukraine in the 1600s and 1700s, and as a result, later on, when Russia started trying to open up its Black Earth region in Siberia, which is that's basically southern Siberia. That's below the permafrost, where the ground is just perpetually frozen, almost perpetually frozen anyway, and sort of the desert, semi-arid regions in Central Asia. There's like a little narrow strip of fertile land between those areas, all along Siberia, running east-west. And that's a good area for agriculture. So the Russian government tried to develop that, in particular in the 19th century and early 20th century, partly for strategic reasons, because they wanted to populate it so people actually lived there so they could have some economic activity there that would justify the Russian military being there and help pay for it. But regardless, when they did that, most of the settlers, well, a disproportionately large share, let's say, of the settlers that moved in were actually Ukrainian. And that's partly because there had been such a population boom in Ukraine that they had a lot of surplus people, basically, that needed and wanted new land. And so there's actually a pretty decent number of ethnic Ukrainians, or at least the descendants of ethnic Ukrainians, in southern Siberia as a result, kind of in a belt going all the way to the Russian Far East. So like I said earlier, I guess you can say that's an example of how integrated the two peoples were over time. There's also a lot of ethnic Ukrainians in southern Russia and the Caucasus region. That's also an area that was disproportionately populated by Ukrainians. So again, lots of intermixing. But to focus on Ukraine, it's eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine where most of the ethnic Russians were living. So skipping ahead, economically speaking, there was a lot of disruption. Eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine were disproportionately industrialized, and as a result, were disproportionately negatively impacted by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the reason that's relevant is because that's where the Russians were. So right away, right from the start of the founding of independent Ukraine, a lot of the ethnic Russian population is already disgruntled because a lot of them have lost their livelihoods. They can't go to the mines anymore or the factories anymore because a lot of those have closed, or at least they're not hiring as much. Or if they're maintaining their, if they're maintaining their workforce, they're not paying their workforce on time. That was also very common in the 90s. So people are just kind of angry and upset, while people in the West are not as bad off. And that's also where more of the Ukrainian nationalists are, in the western part of Ukraine. So there was just inherent tension there between East and West from the beginning. Now, that gets even more complicated when you throw in Russian foreign policy. Because, like I mentioned, Russia's Black Sea Fleet was headquartered in Sevastopol, which, upon independence of Ukraine, was part of a separate country. So, what to do about that? So, the solution was to lease the port. The Russian government negotiated with Kiev, and the outcome was something like a 20-year lease on the port in which the Russians could continue to govern it and use it as they needed to in order to continue to project power into the Black Sea region. They didn't do much of that in the 90s because, again, the Russian government's finances were a mess, so they didn't really have enough money to do much with their navy, but they did at least preserve the port and their access to it, so that was the key thing for them. Now, Ukrainian nationalists didn't always like that, but they also didn't want to get into a confrontation with Russia about it, because obviously, if you're the Russian government, and certainly if you're a Russian nationalist, being cut off from Crimea would be a significant blow, strategically, but also just in terms of the historical significance of losing a territory that was important, to Russia historically in its expansion. So for a long time after that, this sort of combination of issues, the economic dislocation, the strategic value of Crimea, and disgruntled Russians in eastern Ukraine were pretty big parts of politics in Ukraine, trying to square all of these circles while also trying to deal with oligarchic competition, as well as energy dependence. I didn't mention that. Ukraine depends on Russia for a lot of its natural gas, or at least it used to. And as a result, that gave the Russian government a lot of leverage over Ukraine, because if they wanted to, in the dead of winter, they could just cut them off from gas and force people to basically freeze in their homes, which, of course, is not going to be a popular move, certainly for any government under whose watch it may have happened. So all of that created a kind of witch's brew. So overall, the Ukrainian government dealt with that by just trying to pacify Russia. Like, they just tried to maintain decent relations. They tried to get some access, but market access, that is to say. But they had pretty mixed success in that. I don't think I've read that the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was sort of this. It was kind of like the British Commonwealth of Nations that the British formed after the collapse of the British Empire. But it wasn't as effective. I mean, for one, they weren't paying out as much money as the British do in the Commonwealth of Independent States, or rather the Commonwealth of Nations. The Russian CIS doesn't have quite as much to recommend it in that regard, so there's not quite as much loyalty amongst the member states over time. There were a number of states that didn't even want to join after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think Turkmenistan being the prime case in point, but I think also Georgia. I want to say Georgia is not a part of the CIS either. But regardless, limited success in maintaining the flow of economic activity between Russia and Ukraine over the course of the 90s and aughts. Russians were pretty ready to use natural gas as a weapon when they liked, but the Ukrainians were generally pretty good about avoiding that for a long time. So let's see, and then oligarchic competition, whatever. So let's go on. So 90s ends, you get into the aughts. So over the course of the 90s, there was a lot of corruption, lots of oligarchs, and eventually that came to a head in 2004. So there was an election then that was just very clearly fraudulent. Like, it was obvious to everybody that there had been a lot of corruption. And the president who had, quote unquote, won that election was a guy named Yanukovych. And he was considered pro-Russian. He was kind of more of an Eastern Ukrainian guy. And Eastern Ukrainians supported him, partly for that reason, but also just because of other policies, being pro-Russian, wanting to support Eastern Ukraine, etc. So he was more popular in the East. But in the West, the Orange Coalition, I don't remember what it was called exactly. I want to call it the Orange Coalition, but basically a coalition led by a guy named Yushchenko in partnership with a oligarch named Tymoshenko, Yulia Tymoshenko, precisely. I remember her very well because, for one, she was a woman, which was unusual for Ukrainian political elites, but also she had these Princess Leia buns that she used to wear, or at least her hairstyle reminded me of Princess Leia buns. She had a very memorable presentation at that time. Old Man Smith telling you his stories here. So Tymoshenko and Yushchenko teamed up to criticize the corrupt election, such as it was seen. And they organized a protest movement. And so that turned into large enough protests that the government agreed to rerun the election. And this time, Yushchenko and the pro-Western crowd actually won. And that was called the Orange Revolution. It was one of the color revolutions, as they were called at the time, that happened in the early aughts, thereabouts. There were a couple others, but I won't go into them now. But basically, that really put off the Russian government, as well as Russian nationalists, because from their perspective, it looked like a pro-Western coup of a kind. It wasn't really. It was really just people upset at corruption and then people fighting with each other. Like, again, there had always been tension between West and East Ukraine. So no surprise that there would be a protest movement by the Western Ukrainians when they perceived themselves to have lost an election because of fraud. So that happens, protest movement, election rerun, the reformers are able to win, and Russia's a little bit upset. So in general, the Russian government was upset by color revolutions in general because a lot of them happened in their sort of area, in their so-called sphere of influence. Georgia was one of them, for example. And the Russian government came to associate them with the West, either with Western conspiracies or at the very least with pro-Western political forces in neighboring states that they were not friendly with. And as a result, they had a very negative impression of them. And they started to strive over time, but not right away, but over time, they started more and more to try to exert pressure on their neighboring states to try to discourage these kinds of movements and to support political elites in neighboring countries that were favorable to Russia. And all of this basically to try to defend perceived anyway, Russian interests in those states, either maintaining them as buffer states between themselves and the West, or at least maintaining them as, not dependents per se, but as markets to which they had disproportionate access. Even with all of the economic dislocation, they still had better access to those states than, say, the European Union members in general, at least for a while, up until Ukraine and Georgia and other former Soviet states started signing association agreements of one kind or another, in which they lowered tariffs. But that's a whole other story. Anyway, this isn't really brief, but I'm trying to be thorough as best I can for stuff that's coming off the top of my head.
You're doing great.
So that was the Orange Revolution. I think that's what it was called. That's what I want to call it anyway. And for a while, it looked like Ukraine would have a reform government that would make it more democratic, that would implement economic reforms, that would try to fight the oligarchs, and that would be just more pro-Western in general. That didn't really happen because almost immediately after the new government took power, there was a lot of infighting between Yushchenko and Timoshenko. And that resulted in basically the collapse of the government. It didn't collapse right away, but there was so much infighting that it couldn't do anything. And when the next election happened, it was actually Yanukovych, the guy who had been basically kicked out as a result of the Orange Revolution. He was able to become president again. He won that election. And he won it legitimately. Like, he was genuinely popular, especially, again, in the eastern part of the country. I think his party was called Party of Regions. That's what's coming to mind anyway. So this obviously was great for Russia. They liked Yanukovych. They saw him as pro-Russian. And so they tried to take it easy on him. They gave him discounts on gas imports and, little things like that to try to make things a little better in Ukraine such that he might maintain his popularity. So that was all good and well. But there was one problem. Over the course of the governance of the Orange Coalition, Yushchenko and Timoshenko, one of the things they had managed to do was to move Ukraine closer to the European Union. And they had started negotiations on an association agreement in which there would be lower tariffs and whatnot, but which would also serve as a kind of guide path along which Ukraine could travel and eventually get to European Union membership. That was going to take a long time because European Union membership comes with a lot of caveats. You have to meet a lot of preconditions, among them minimizing corruption, having a relatively strong administrative state, a relatively strong economy, a relatively stable currency, stable finances. You can't have too much money in debt, for example. Lots of little things. And it was obvious it was going to take Ukraine a long time to do that. But the association agreement would have created basically a legal obligation on the part of the Ukrainian government by treaty in order to follow that path. And pro-Western Ukrainians were very much for that. And when the pro-Western coalition was out of power, when Yanukovych became president again, He nominally maintained those negotiations, and nominally, even under his government, Ukraine was still on the path to integrating with the West. And that was of mixed popularity. Some people liked it, some people didn't. Some people would have preferred integration with Russia because they identified more with Russia. Some people didn't really care that much because they didn't trust either Russia or Europe. And of course, some people saw Europe as the best hope, the most likely approach that would result not only in a better economy, but also less corruption and a more representative government. So just lots of disagreements there. But eventually what happened is on the verge of signing, I believe this is the case, Chat can correct me on this, on the verge of signing the association agreement, he was basically summoned by Russian officials to a meeting. I don't think it was with Putin per se, but I think it was with some kind of high-level Russian official. So he goes to the meeting, and then when he comes back, all of a sudden, again, this is just before the association agreement is to be signed, all of a sudden he announces that he's not going to sign. It's not going to happen. Ukraine will not sign the association agreement and will basically not continue its integration with the West. And possibly, it was implicit in the statement, possibly integrate more with Russia. This was very upsetting to a lot of people. Now, obviously, Ukrainian nationalists don't particularly trust Russia, even then. But even amongst other groups, like, say, liberal reformers who wanted a more liberal representative democracy, human rights, representative government, that kind of thing, rule of law especially, those people in particular were upset because they didn't think alignment with Russia would result in an improvement in Ukrainian governments. Europe was seen as the more likely approach to result in an improvement in governance. So they in particular were upset at this. And the result were protests. People came out into Kiev, the capital, specifically the center square of Kiev, which was Maidan. Maidan literally means center. It's not like a special name per se. But they started protesting there. And they were basically demanding that the government reverse its decision on the association agreement, among other things. Now, the protests were very popular amongst the pro-Western crowd, the reform crowd, and the nationalist crowd. But obviously they were never very popular with the ethnic Russian crowd, because again, they were very skeptical of Ukrainian nationalism, and they were inherently more sympathetic to Russia. So they didn't really like the protests, and they were kind of hoping the government would be able to weather the storm, so to speak. Now, at first, the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych tried to disperse the protests. They kind of gave them time, they let them protest a little, but as they started getting larger and more disruptive, they started sending in the police to try to disperse them. Now, it's at this point that there's really nothing I can say about this that won't get me yelled at by somebody. Because this is where it really gets controversial. There's a lot of different impressions and opinions about what happens going forward. So I'll give the usual disclaimer now. I should have given it before, but I think it's particularly pertinent now. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I'm stronger in some subject areas than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And I do enjoy the feedback we get of one kind or another in chat. So just keep that in mind. So that said, so at this point, whatever you think may have happened, Ukrainian hard-right nationalists really jump into the fray and become notable parts of the protest. They were probably there before, but at this point they become particularly notable because they basically start fighting with the police. Actively, physically fighting them with their fists or with, bludgeons of one kind or another, but sometimes also with firearms. And as a casual outside observer anyway, I wasn't there, but as a casual outside observer monitoring this situation from afar, it really seemed like the protests would have been crushed if not for the hard right intervening. Because it kind of looked like the police were kind of on the path to just dispersing the protests outright. But they received so much pushback from the hard right that they basically couldn't do it. And the Ukrainian government at this point started to get worried because they weren't entirely sure whether or not they would actually have the forces necessary to eject the protesters. They could have used violent force, but that would, of course, instigated a pretty dramatic reaction. And so they seemed very reluctant to do that. Like sending in the army, for example. They could have always done that, but they didn't want to, it seems. So the Russian police, well, not the Russian police, the Ukrainian police, rather, were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Like they were not being cleared to use as much force as probably would have been necessary to clear the protests, but at the same time, they were still being told to do something. And so they fought with the protesters. People died on one side or the other. Some people say some of the deaths were false flags caused by one side trying to blame the other. I'm not going to get into that. People can argue about that in chat if they want. But regardless of who killed who or why, there was a lot of fighting there in Maidan in this period, at this stage of the protests. And it's at this point that Russian media really went into overdrive. A lot of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine really consumed a lot more Russian media than they did Ukrainian media. And Russian media, some of it backed by the Russian, well, probably most of it backed by the Russian government, really started to paint a picture of a Ukraine that was just in chaos and that was melting down and that was under attack by far-right fascists. Now, I probably should have explained this before too, but we've talked about this a couple times before. There were far-right, basically Nazi Ukrainian nationalists who fought against the Soviet Union in World War II. They were nationalists who rose up when the Nazis invaded and basically sided with the Germans at first and targeted communists and some Russians and whatnot. Later on, they turned on the Germans too because it was obvious the Germans were just going to kill pretty much everybody. But regardless, once Ukraine had been liberated and the Soviets had reconquered it, these right-wing nationalists continued fighting. As they continued fighting a guerrilla war against the Soviet Union for something like 10 years after the war ended, so from 45 to roughly 55. And I think they were led by a guy named Bandera, something like that. I can never quite remember his name correctly. Maybe somebody in chat can pitch in there. But regardless, the existence of these guerrilla fighters and the violence they perpetrated, and especially the fact that they aligned with Nazis, at first anyway, in the war, all of that created a very negative impression of Ukrainian nationalism amongst Russians. And again, part of that is because of Russian media. Russian media went out of its way to paint those nationalists in a very negative light, not only because they were Nazis, but also because they wanted to try to tamp down on any idea of separatism in Ukraine, as well as just the idea of an independent Ukraine in general. So skipping ahead, ever since then, the Russian community, Russian culture, has had this idea of the far-right Ukrainian nationalist. It's sort of in the cultural memory of Russians. Now, moving back to the present, well, not present, but 11 or so, during, the whole Euromaidan incident. Actually, it was 2014, wasn't it? Well, during Euromaidan anyway, Russian media went into overdrive, and they basically resurrected this right-wing image, right-wing Ukrainian nationalist image that had been ingrained in Russian culture ever since World War II. And they started trying to paint the protesters and the far-righters, as well as eventually the Ukrainian government, when it actually did change, as being far-right Nazis in nature. And this is really where you see all of the propaganda about Ukraine being run by Nazis and about Ukrainian Nazis being behind Euromaidan and all that jazz. That idea was not originally meant for outside consumption, that is to say, consumption outside of Russia. The idea of Ukrainian Nazis being a threat was an idea targeted at Russians, because they were receptive to that. Again, there was that pre-existing cultural memory of far-right Ukrainian Nazis. And so it was very easy to tap that sort of stereotype and use it to try to portray Ukraine, the Ukrainian protesters specifically, in a negative light. Now, that was also easy because, like I mentioned way earlier, there was a lot of negative associations Russians had of Ukrainians that were still persisting. They still kind of saw them as little Russians, even at this stage, right? Even when Ukraine is independent and has its own country and culture and whatnot, there were a lot of Russians, especially Russian nationalists in particular, I should say, that just saw them as this errant branch of Russians who needed to come back to the motherland and eventually be assimilated. And so that sort of opinion, that sort of haughty perspective of Ukrainians also made it easier for Russian media to paint Ukrainians as being basically unfit to govern themselves. They cited the whole unrest around Euromaidan as evidence of political chaos in Ukraine and of the innate instability and inability of Ukrainian politics to manage Ukrainian affairs. And then, of course, they threw in the Ukrainian Nazi bit as well, just to illustrate how evil the most nationalist Ukrainians were. So all of that was very targeted on the Russian population, not only in Russia, but Eastern Ukraine, and it was effective. It was an impactful message. But it also bled out outside of the area into the West, and so that's where you see weird combinations of people pushing the Ukrainian Nazi narrative, like Steven Seagal and also like neo-Nazis in the West. All of them agree on the Ukrainian neo-Nazi narrative, which you would not expect them to agree on much of anything, but they agree on that because that message really resonated amongst countercultural elements in the West. And so that's where they settled. So for a long time, nobody gave a shit about Ukraine, outside of Ukraine and Russia anyway, and Eastern Europe. I'm talking specifically about Western Europe and America here. So for a long time, we didn't really care about the issue. And so it was really easy for the Nazi narrative to really gain traction because there was no real opposition to it. There was not like a powerful group of pro-Ukrainian peoples or an ideology that already existed in the West that was inclined to be sympathetic to Ukrainians. Rather, we had a pre-existing set of ideologies, really, that were inclined to be either more sympathetic to Russia or at least inherently skeptical to anything pro-Western in nature. So that made it very hard for any kind of countervailing narrative to emerge. And that's why so much work had to be done at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, and still has to be done even now, to try to dispel this old idea that it was just Ukrainian Nazis that were responsible for Euromaidan, and that the poor ethnic Russian population of eastern Ukraine was being oppressed until the Russians liberated their brethren. So all of that stemmed, in the beginning, from Euromaidan and the participation of the far-right radicals in the protests. And again, the protests, I don't think, could have succeeded without them, because probably the police would have been able to disperse all the other protests. Because the other protesters were like kids, just workers, business owners. They're not really the kind of people that, want to fist fight a cop in riot gear. That's not the type. But the far right guys were, they were basically, in a lot of cases, they were thugs. And so that made them uniquely prepared for that kind of conflict. I mean, they'd been explicitly preparing for that kind of conflict. So they were ready for it, and they had the arms to back it up. And so the fact that they were there and played such an important role, the point I'm making is that's where that myth of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi government, that's where that came from. That was the genesis of that. So anyway, going back to Euromaidan, at this point there was a kind of stalemate. The Ukrainian government under Yanukovych didn't really know what to do, and the pressure was just growing. He was getting pressure from the West, he was getting pressure from Russia, he was getting pressure from pro-Russian Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, who were also protesting against the protests in Euromaidan. And of course, he was getting all the pressure in Kiev itself from the pro-Western crowd in Maidan. So what's he to do? So what does he do, Neuro? He runs away. He just picks up and he leaves the country. Not just Kiev, he just leaves the country and just stops being president. It was a weird move. Like, even to this day, I don't fully understand why he did that. Like, it seems to me like he could have stayed and he could have made it work eventually. Maybe there would have been a lot of unrest in the capital, but it seems like he could have just waited it out. Like, that's what most governments do when there's big protests. You can generally wait them out. They have to go back to work or school or something sooner or later. So invariably, you have the advantage of time. But he didn't do that. He just picked up and left. And at that point, it was very easy for the opposition to fill the gap, because it seemed to them like he had just, dereliction of duty, basically. He had just given up his post. And so they decided to just move in. And I think they had some weird procedural rules that they used in order to replace him with an opposition president. And that's where you get the presidency of the chocolate guy. What was his name? He's like, he owns huge portions of the confectionery business in Ukraine. He's known for making chocolate. Poroshenko, that's what his name was. So Poroshenko becomes president. He's an oligarch. He owns lots of industries, especially, candy and stuff like that. And he was not entirely the first choice of the nationalists or the reformists, because, again, he's an oligarch, so, nobody likes oligarchs, but he was pretty much the only political elite that was kind of willing, or at least was in the pole position, to take on the position, so he became president. So that's when the shit really hits the fan. At this point, the pro-Western reformer crowd has their way, they have their preferred government, but now the people who are pro-Russian in eastern Ukraine are very upset. And at this point, there's protests, but there's also increasingly some violence. The extremists, you might say, extremist separatists really go out of their way to start attacking, say, Ukrainian military, sometimes the police, sometimes local authorities they see as being too pro-Ukrainian or pro-government. But in general, it's pretty manageable. Like in some areas, there was a declaration of independence, basically. They tried to separate from themselves from Ukraine and try to set up an independent state, but they weren't really having much success. And overall, the Ukrainian military was able to contain them. And, to be fair, there actually were atrocities. It's not as though the Ukrainian army was like completely innocent here. There were a fair amount of innocent people anyway, who ended up getting killed in violence for one reason or another. And that's also true of some of the Russian protesters. The famous example here of Russian protesters being killed was the fire in the city of Odessa. There was something like 50 to 100, I don't remember the exact number of Russian protesters who were in a building. I don't remember if they were protesting or if they were just meeting there, but somebody set the building on fire and blocked the exits. And so something like several dozen people ended up being burned to death as a result. So that's one of the big examples right there of atrocities in the east of Ukraine. Well, in that case, the south of Ukraine, but basically the pro-Russian part of Ukraine. So that was real, that was not just entirely made up. But the separatist movement was really not gaining enough traction to really succeed. And this is where you see the so-called little green men. This is where you see the Russian army be deployed into eastern Ukraine as well as Crimea in order to seize territory. And in the case of Crimea, they seize it and annex it outright. I think they didn't hardly waste any time at all in annexing Crimea and making it an official oblast of Russia. But in the case of the separatist republics in Donbass, they didn't do that. And, they moved in, they secured the territory. They weren't able to take all of the provinces, but I think they took something like half of each. And they basically just propped up the local independent governments as little statelets, pseudo-independent. They were heavily dependent on Russian money and military support. But the Russian government refused to integrate them. And not entirely clear why. Maybe they wanted them to actually be part of Ukraine so they could act as basically infiltrators, so they could act as Russian proxies within Ukrainian politics. Or maybe they just didn't want, or maybe they just wanted to continue to use them as leverage. If they outright annex them, that basically removes any leverage they have over Ukraine. If they at least maintain their independence, then they can dangle the possibility of allowing them to return to Ukraine in future. Speculation on my part, but that's the most likely probability, in my opinion, anyway. But regardless, that kind of gets into the whole Donbass war and then future events. But basically, the question was about Euromaidan. This is effectively the brief quote-unquote summary. A brief summary plus a lot of background. Let's put it like that.
And so basically, Ukraine is a very large country that has a distinct ethnic group and a distinct language that is borrowing concepts from neighboring languages and countries. Russia would be the largest actor that is near it. So there's kind of that constant tug of war between what is the national Ukrainian identity and then what is the broader Slavic and or Russian identity, and how that tug of war has been going for a lot longer than just the most recent war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a pretty long-term issue.
Yeah, it's been a kind of running debate within, the Imperial Russian government, the Soviet Union, and then the Russian Federation over the past 30 years. Like, how do you deal with Ukraine? How do you project Russian influence, maintain economic ties, without, alienating the population, which effectively is what they've done. Talking about the Russian side of things is a whole other conversation, how Russia manages its affairs with Ukraine. That's a whole other explainer, so to speak. But yeah, Euromaidan was very much a Ukrainian event. And that's as concise a summary as I could provide. But yeah, you're right. That sort of tension between identities is also part of the issue on the Ukrainian side, because Ukrainian nationalists, of course, want to build and reinforce the separate Ukrainian identity as much as possible. Yeah, they have good reason to. It's not as though they haven't had problems in the past with other peoples and governments governing them. But then, of course, that just brings you back to the original question, are they really a separate people? So I'm sure people in chat will argue about that.
And then another thing that we talk about with Agent Smith is that every news source has a bias, every person has a bias, and we're no exception to that. One of the things that Americans tend to see more of is pro-Ukrainian news, propaganda, that kind of a thing, as opposed to pro-Russian. Doesn't mean that that's the universal, but that's, I think, the average. So we tend to see more stuff that's more favorable to them. Like in the U.S., we really like the idea of freedom fighters and people standing up for their country and fighting for their country and that kind of a thing. So if we're just looking at different conflicts around the world, that's a pretty common pattern that we'll fall into.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, the Russian invasion definitely triggered a lot of impulses in the West. None of them particularly favorable to Russia.
Yeah, well, they were the ones who invaded another country. Technically,
they did start it. Yeah, from the perspective of other countries, it's none of our business. Other countries outside of Europe, I mean, it's not as though Eastern Europe is the only region that Westerners kind of project their own morality upon. Like Taiwan and China is a good example. From the perspective of Chinese, and again, especially Chinese nationalists, Taiwan is an internal issue for Chinese people to settle. Why are you Westerners interfering in it? It's none of your business. That's their perspective on it. And of course, from our perspective, yeah, it is your issue to settle, but we're not going to let you just crush a liberal democracy out of convenience. That doesn't sit well in the West. Nobody would like that. Yeah, I think part of the issue, too, is that politics are a little different in places like China. Not to get too off track, but, one of the things I've noticed talking with people from China, like mainland China, is that they don't really think in terms of political ideologies that much. So, for example, explaining World War II can be a little tricky, because for them, they'll see World War II in terms of a war between nationalities, between states, like Germans versus like the French, Germans versus Russians, etc. And I remember even talking with a Chinese guy in grad school, and he was kind of perplexed as to how Americans could have such a favorable view of Germany, given that they were an enemy, not so long ago. I guess half a century is pretty long, but referencing World War II, he was surprised at how friendly we were towards the German people, given the war given the two separate wars, we ended up fighting against them. And I had to explain to him that we don't really see it as a war against the German people per se. It was against a particular German ideology, in the case of World War II anyway. It wasn't a war against the German state or the German people so much as it was a war against fascism. And so that's what we think of when we think of World War II. We don't think of it as being like the last good American war, because it was morally, well, we think of it as being like the last pure American war in the sense that it was morally unambiguous, because the enemy were just Nazis, which, from the perspective of liberal Democrats, such as those who dominate Western Europe and North America, Nazis are explicitly evil. Like, you can't really justify that ideology from the perspective of somebody of a liberal mindset. And again, I'm using liberal in like the classical liberal sense, Enlightenment liberalism. Everybody in America is basically liberal by that definition. So in that sense, we were fighting against the idea, not the people. And I kind of had to, again, I had to explain that to him. That was kind of a weird notion to him that people would think of a war against a specific state as being a war against an idea dominating that state rather than the state itself. Yeah, that was something you could see in World War II a lot, actually. You could see people of all nationalities fighting against their own nationalities and everybody else on all sides of the conflict. Like, it was really crazy. Like, you might not think of French people as being, you would think of French people as being very anti-German, right? But after France was defeated, there was actually a pretty decent number of French people who volunteered to fight on the Eastern Front. as part of French SS units. And one of the last German units in World War II who fought to the very bitter end in the Battle of Berlin in 1945 was a French SS unit because they didn't think they had anywhere to go. I mean, surrender to the Red Army wasn't an option because everybody knows what happens there, right? They either just kill you on the spot or they take you to a gulag and then you die there. Either way, you're not having a good time. But also, they can't go back to France because now the Liberal Democrats are back in charge since they were liberated, right? So if you're a French SS unit, you're kind of screwed in 1945. You pretty much have no place to go. So they actually were, weirdly, somewhat ironically, one of the last German units to actually fight in the war, even against overwhelming odds. They just didn't think they had a choice. So, French people fighting for the Nazis, Poles fighting for the Red Army, like just lots of weird shit. I think one of my favorite stories from World War II, we're getting way off on a tangent here, but...
Well, we mostly got Euromaidan, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite stories, and they actually made a movie about this. I don't remember the title, but it was about a guy in Korea, a Korean man, I should say. And this is when Korea was a part of Japan. It was still a Japanese colony. For those of you who don't know, Japan colonized Korea for like half a century. So they have the same relationship as Ireland and the UK, basically. So this Korean guy was a soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. I think he was a conscript. I don't think he volunteered or anything. And so if you're a World War II nerd, and I suspect most of the people watching a StarCraft Twitch stream probably are to some degree, then you probably know about the border conflicts between Imperial Japan and the Soviet Union in Manchuria. For those of you who don't know, that's a whole other explanation, but basically there were two major battles fought between the Red Army and the Imperial Japanese Army on the frontiers of their respective empires, specifically along the border of northwestern Manchuria in the Far East. So the Russians got the better of both of those battles. And the fact that they were able to crush the Japanese army so easily is one of the reasons that the Japanese army stopped advocating for an invasion of the Soviet Union and started supporting the Navy's proposition of invading Southeastern Asia. Again, another story. But basically, the gist of it is the Russians and the Japanese fight in Manchuria. And where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, the Korean guy. So he fought there. He was in one of those battles. I think it was Namenhan or something. And so he starts out as a member of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he's captured by the Russians in what I think is the Battle of Namenhan. And the Russians take him prisoner, and they hold him in a POW camp for, however long. But it wasn't long after that that World War II starts, specifically the invasion of... No, Poland would have been 39. Namenhan would have been like 40. So I think he would have been a prisoner for maybe like 6 months to a year or so, and then Operation Barbarossa happened, which is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So at that point, the Soviets go to the Koreans they have in their POW camps and ask them if they would be willing to fight against Germany. And they offer to support Korean independence if they do so. So of course, if you're a Korean nationalist, that's not a bad deal. It's certainly better than being in a Soviet POW camp. So this guy takes them up on the offer. And he ends up getting deployed to the Eastern Front. And I don't think he's there long before he ends up fighting and getting captured by the Germans. And so what did the Germans do with him? Well, obviously they make him a POW, but the Germans rather, had a shortage of labor, right? So they needed people to work on various projects, because a lot of the German men were in the army. And so they actually put him, along with other POWs, to work on various, fortification projects, civil works projects, whatever it is they need. And one of the biggest projects in German-occupied Europe at that time was building what was called the Atlantic Wall, which was the set of fortifications along northwestern Europe that were intended to defend against a potential invasion by Anglo-American forces. So, after those fortifications are built, some of those POWs involved in the construction were actually assigned to man those fortified positions. Obviously, they did so under the supervision of German officers and other German soldiers. But more than a few of the defenders, along the Atlantic Wall were actually just POWs of one sort or another who had been forced to man positions, either feeding ammunition into a gun or what have you, whatever it was that they needed. So Guess where he was on D-Day? He was right there in Normandy. And guess who gets captured? This guy. He gets captured by, I think, American forces. And so, once again, he ends up in a POW camp, this time an American POW camp. But here's the thing. When the United States took POWs, it put them in POW camps in the United States because it was obviously much harder to escape from camps there. So this guy, again, this is just a Korean dude who had been conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He's now crossed the entire Eurasian landmass. And now he's being taken across the Atlantic Ocean so that he can be interned in a POW camp in the middle of the United States. And I think it was there that he stayed until the end of the war, whereupon he was released and traveled back to Korea. So World War II had lots of just wild... I don't think there were very many stories as wild as that guy's story, but there was lots of weird alliances and stories like that where people ended up fighting on sides of the conflict and in places that you would not have expected them.
That guy sounds like a world jail speedrunner.
Yeah. Yeah, he got around for sure.
Yep, there's a reason it's a world war and not just a local conflict. It's interesting how, like, even if it wasn't a primary country that had a major stake in the conflict, like, the resources that were thrown into the conflict can come from other places.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So he
the United States.
Who knows where?
Yeah. Well, that was resources and, unexpected origins for resources in the war. That basically defines Latin America's place in the war, because a lot of what Latin America did in World War II was coordinate with the United States to try to ensure as few resources produced in Latin America made their way to the Axis as possible. So there was no actual fighting in Latin America during World War II. But there was a lot of diplomacy going on, designed both to avert fighting and prevent fighting, but also to coordinate so that they could support fighting happening in other theaters. And like I've mentioned before, there were plans for a potential fighting. There were plans for a potential outbreak of fighting, rather, in South America specifically, because Argentina was relatively pro-German during the war. And there was a real concern that they might jump into the war at some point and maybe invade Brazil, or something wild like that. So there was a war plan drawn up in which they would help Brazil defend itself, basically, and defeat Argentina. But yeah, I think, one of the arrangements the United States made was for Peru and Chile in particular, they made arrangements to buy all of the raw materials, specifically strategic raw materials like copper. They arranged to just buy all of it. Like everything they could produce, they agreed to buy, regardless of how much it might be. Because the United States wanted to make absolutely sure that none of it ended up in Germany or Italy or Japan or wherever. Pretty expensive deal when you think about it, because obviously you have a pretty big incentive there to produce as much as humanly possible. But of course that was also useful because the United States was basically trying to produce as much stuff as humanly possible over the course of the war. But they definitely made bank as a result. Also, I think there was a key ingredient to, I don't remember what it was called exactly. Basically, there was this plant that was native to Peru. And it was a key ingredient to medicine that could be used to treat malaria. And of course, there was a lot of fighting in World War II in areas that had a lot of malaria, specifically the South Pacific. So medicine for malaria was in high demand as a result. But the trouble the Allies had is that most of this stuff, the plant had been transplanted to Southeast Asia, and most of it was being grown there at the outbreak of the war. But of course, if you know the Pacific Theater, that area was conquered very quickly by Japan, after Japan entered the war. So that created some big problems for the Allies logistically as far as maintaining access to malaria medication. So what they did instead is they started scouring the Andes Mountains to try to find this plant And it was actually really hard to find because over the course of several centuries, when the Spanish were there, they had basically extracted it to the point of near extinction. Because of course, if you're Spanish living in the area, you want that medicine. It was a very effective medicine, and malaria was a big problem. And so they over extracted it to the point of extinction. And by the time of the 20th century, it was very rare in the Andes. If you wanted it, you had to get it from one of the other places it had been transplanted to. But the need was so great and the alternatives so few that Allied planners basically said, hey, we just have to send people out into the countryside in a desperate bid to find as much of this stuff as possible. And it did end up working. They did end up finding enough of the plant in order to make the medicine in question. And so that was the primary source for malaria medication for specifically Allied forces in the Pacific, mostly, who were the ones most in need of it. But Peru's cooperation was critical there. Like they could have hypothetically, if they wanted to, cut off the Allies from that plant, and they would have had no way to basically make effective malaria medication as a result. But because the Peruvian government was willing to play along, and because the United States gave them lots of incentives to, we were able to ensure that supply. So that's one of the lesser known diplomatic battles, you might say, of the conflict, that the Allies were able to win out. Not sure how I got onto World War II. I'm pretty sure there was something that pushed me into that, but I don't remember what it was.
Dagnip Googled it. Thinks the herb is quinine, Quinine.
That sounds right. I think that's it. I don't know how to pronounce it though. But yeah, I think that is correct. Yeah, there was lots of drama in South America. Lots of German spies and spycraft and whatnot operating down there because there was a lot of people there that kind of were militaristic in their outlook and political affinities. There had been, in the early 20th century, one of the big trends in South American politics, especially in the southern Cone region, was that there was a lot of sort of pro-German militarism, especially hard nationalism. And places like Paraguay, Bolivia in particular, saw a lot of that. Some in Chile. There was actually a far-right coup attempt in Chile at one point in the 1940s, I think. It definitely scared people a lot. They'd never seen that before. But it wasn't successful, and they didn't have nearly enough support to really go anywhere with it. Argentina was kind of more of a problem, but that was partly because they were going through some difficult events. I think they had a particular name for it. Like the 1930s in Argentina has a special name, but I don't quite remember what it was. It was like a lost decade. I almost want to say La Violencia, but that's a Colombian thing. Yeah, maybe Dagnep knows. But yeah, it's trying to plan around and contain German influence in South America was like an ongoing clandestine activity for the Allies, specifically the United States, in South America, pretty much throughout World War II. Well, were there any other hot topics we wanted to get to?
Some people were asking about the passing of the Queen of England. I know that it's not like a major political role that she has, but there's a good bit of like symbolism, and she does have things to say that can impact Britain and what have you. And then one of the things that I had seen people postulating online was that a lot of countries that used to be beholden to the crown in some sense had sort of put a lot of that process on pause because like they thought that Queen Elizabeth was all right, and now that she's out they might be reassessing like, do we want to still have her or the British monarch as the head of state? Because I think Canada has that, but Canada would need to pass a certain vote, which would involve Quebec also agreeing on that. And I was reading that Quebec oftentimes disagrees with the rest of Canada on almost everything.
Yeah. Yeah, every so often you hear about one or the other state in the Commonwealth talking about removing the Queen as their technical legal head of state. Not generally a lot of support for it. I mean, I think a lot of people see it as just a peripheral issue that doesn't really matter. Although I think, what was it? Antigua decided to do that recently. Antigua is a Caribbean island nation in the southern Caribbean. I think they decided to ditch the royal family and become a formal republic. But it's not going to have any like real bearing on relations. It's not really going to change anything. It's pretty much a symbolic change more than anything. Yeah, in terms of republicanism, I think I've heard more of it from Australia than Canada. But I think even there it doesn't have a lot of support. It's just kind of a weird niche issue for a lot of people.
Yeah. It's almost like a museum piece in some sense, because the monarch doesn't really have that much actual power in their ability to make policy and like move troops around and things like that compared to what it used to be. But it's almost like a major point of nostalgia for people. But it's a fairly expensive thing to prop up tax money wise, so I can see why some people would take issue with it. A lot of monarchs in Europe were thrown off very violently whenever that was going through, like French Revolution being an example.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, lots of issues and problems for monarchs in the 19th century. That was very much the era of revolutionary liberalism. I'm kind of surprised so many were able to survive. Because Belgium still has a king. No, wait, no, not Belgium. Or is it Belgium? Does Belgium still have a king? I think the Netherlands does.
Countries still have a monarch.
Sweden does. Denmark? I think Denmark still has one, don't they?
List of current monarchies. Let's go. Andorra, Antigua, and Barbuda. Australia, which is Charles III. A lot of these are just going to reference the British monarch. The Bahamas, Bahrain. They have their
Spain.
Belgium. Yes, they do have King Felipe. Belize. That would be Charles III. Bhutan. They have a king. Brunei.
Brunei. Yeah, that's a Southeast Asian country. A very, very small Southeast Asian country.
They have a sultan. Cambodia has a king. I'll just show this on stream. Canada references Charles III. Denmark has a queen, Margrethe II. Eswatini has a king. Grenada, Charles III. Jamaica, Charles III. Japan has an emperor. Kuwait has an emir. Jordan has a king. Lesotho has a king. Liechtenstein has a sovereign prince. Luxembourg has a grand duke. Wow. Not just a regular ass duke. Malaysia has a Yang di Pertuan Agong. I don't know what that means, but they have a ruler. Monaco has a sovereign prince. Morocco has a king. Netherlands has a king. New Zealand has a king, which is Charles III. Norway has a king.
Norway?
Yeah, Harold V.
Oh. Didn't know they still had one.
Oman has a sultan. Papua New Guinea has a king. Qatar has an emir. St. Kitts and Nevis has a king. St. Lucia, Charles III. Vincent and Grenadines, Saudi Arabia has King Solomon. Solomon Islands reference Charles III. Spain has King Felipe VI. Sweden has King Carl Gustaf the 16th. Man, there have been a bunch of Carls. Thailand has a king, Rama the 10th. Tonga has a king. Tuvalu, Charles III. UAE, it says they have a president, but I guess he's also considered a monarch in some way. And then,
I mean, it's a union of emirates. So each emirate has its own emir as the head of it.
mm-hmm.
And so the union government inherently is led by one of the leaders of the emirates. And so by definition then is a emir rather.
And then the Vatican has the Pope.
Pope, is that a king?
It says a Pope.
That's not quite the same thing if you ask me, but I guess
Well, they're calling that a
technically.
monarchy.
Yeah.
And he is technically like the spiritual leader of Catholic Church and I guess that city-state of the Vatican. You thought France has a king? You don't want to know what France did to their aristocrats and monarchs. He was pretty metal. Yeah, King Louis. He had a pretty tough day at the office.
Yeah, we almost had a king here in the US. George Washington was given the opportunity.
Really?
Yeah, his dumbass officers offered to make him king.
What? Doesn't that defeat the whole point of what they were trying to fight for?
Yeah, pretty much. But they venerated him so much, and they saw him as such an authentic and quality leader that they thought surely his bloodline would be a good choice for royalty in a new country. But of course, George Washington famously said, "No, I'm not going to do that."
That's the problem with monarchies is all you need is one bad one in the line, and then they get like 80 years reign of terror because it's the divine right of kings.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the breakthrough that we made to have three branches of government with checks and balances and a lot of distribution of power across lots of people is probably a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, there was another guy too. I think his name was Aaron Burr. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
He was the guy who shot Hamilton. You remember Hamilton?
Alexander Hamilton?
Yeah, I think that's what his name was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's the guy who had the play made about him.
Mm-hmm.
So Aaron Burr had it in his head that he could collude with a foreign power and basically take control of America's western territories. I think specifically the Louisiana territory. And he wanted to set himself up as king, basically, of Western America. Didn't work out, fortunately. But it just goes to show you how opportunistic some people were at the time.
Western America would have been what region?
Louisiana, basically
Oh.
Louisiana Purchase region, those territories.
That was a pretty big area, though, right?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Pull it up.
it was not well settled at the time either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we talked about the purchase of Alaska and how for people at the time when the purchase was made, they're like, you just bought a bunch of nothing out there. No one even cares about that. And they get mad at them. And then now looking at the map today and just the value of the region, the oil, the resources, the whatever that's there, it's like, holy shit, that was one of the greatest steals of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah, Louisiana
we got-
Purchase goes up from the eastern part of Louisiana, gets all of Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, the top bit of Texas, Colorado, like over half of it, most of Wyoming, and most of Montana, and even gets into Canada a little bit.
And if you're American, you recognize this from like elementary school. But for those of you not from the United States listening, all of that territory that you're seeing there was bought in one deal. The United States signed a deal with France, in which France, which controlled that territory at the time, I think like around 1800 or so, agreed to sell all of that land in a single deal for the United States. And they sold it for very cheap, relatively speaking. It was a lot of money in absolute value. But in terms of the value per acre of land that was being transferred, it was like pennies on the acre. It was an incredibly cheap purchase on our part.
Hmm.
That is to say, the US part. Yeah, I think chat here is talking about it already. France at the time was controlled by Napoleon, and Napoleon needed money, for all the wars and whatnot.
Hmm.
There's a reason they're called the Napoleonic Wars, right?
So he sold some of this from what France had to the U.S. so that he could fund that stuff.
Oh, he sold all of what France had.
Oh,
That was
really?
all of their territory in North America at that point. And
Wow.
that was actually territory they had recently gotten back. They'd originally technically claimed and controlled that territory. They were the first European power to stake a claim there to the Louisiana region,
Hmm.
such as it was, such as it is here. But they lost pretty much all of it. They lost all of it in the Seven Years' War. And what happened is that the eastern half of the Louisiana Territory was given to England, and then the western half was given to Spain
Hmm.
after that. And then what happened was the Revolutionary War. And of course, the United States becomes an independent country. It takes all of that land there that had been eastern Louisiana, the eastern part of Louisiana Territory.
Hmm.
But then a couple years, I think it was like 1780s or 90s, I don't remember exactly when, but basically the French government leaned on the Spanish government to give them back what had been French Louisiana. So Spain still controlled the western part of what had been Louisiana. The French made them give it back, effectively. And so that's why they had it again, even after they'd lost it before.
Hmm.
But they didn't really have anything they could do with it. They were kind of busy with the French Revolution and the wars and, all kinds of things. So they needed money, and it was just easier to sell that land, basically, and use the money to propagate conflicts in Europe. Yeah, one of the things I remember reading actually was that Napoleon originally had bigger ambitions for North America, that he'd originally been planning on sending an army to expand the Louisiana Territory and expand French claims in North America, but they ended up getting waylaid by the revolution in Haiti.
Mm.
And so that army went to Haiti instead and ended up getting defeated by the Haitian revolutionaries, specifically the slaves who had risen up and were fighting against the plantation owners and the French government forces. And at that point, it was just too difficult to raise another army to send it over. So they just said, screw it. We'll just give up on the whole area and just make some money instead.
Yeah, Moss was saying in chat that it was 15 million for Louisiana purchase,
Yeah, I wonder what that would be now.
adjusted for
It's kind,
inflation.
it's kind of difficult to control for inflation over time like that. Like the further back you go, the more pointless it is, basically.
Yeah.
The structure of the economies and the all the different kinds of goods that were available. There were way fewer goods available at that time. So what does inflation mean then in that context? It's very different. It's just a very different time overall. So it's kind of hard to do that. But overall, it would have been a lot of money even then, just in absolute terms.
Hmm.
It was expensive. We had to take on debt to pay for it. Interesting trivia about the Louisiana Purchase. The president at the time was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was not a Federalist. He did not believe that the federal government of the United States should be strong. He believed that states should have relatively more authority. And he definitely did not believe that the federal government had the authority to unilaterally and on its own initiative purchase land on behalf of the United States. But when he got this offer from France to buy the Louisiana Territory, he had to do it. Like, even for him, as somebody who did not think himself that he, as president, had the authority to do that, he still felt he had to do it because it was just too good a deal to
Hmm.
miss out on. So he actually kind of went against his own principles to make that purchase and to make it happen.
Yeah, it's a deal that's made from desperation, not from like negotiating just something that was going to be really good as a bargain for Napoleon.
Hmm.
It's like I want money now, and I'm willing to take a bad deal in order to be able to do what I need to do at the moment. Interesting. I didn't know that Jefferson didn't originally want to do that. I did know that he was kind of anti-federalist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was always at odds with Federalists like Hamilton and some of the other guys that were more in favor of a large powerful, centralized federal government. Jefferson, I think, was really one of the leading anti-federalists, which probably how he became, well, partly why he became president. Also, he was one of the founders of the country, so that also kind of gave him that name recognition. Yeah, anti-federalists generally did not win office too much in the early going. I think most of the early presidents were federalists. And yeah, I think Washington wasn't really one or the other. I think he was just sort of getting the country working, actually creating the government. But then after him, I think the first president after Washington was Adams, wasn't it? John Adams.
Yep.
So he was a Northeasterner, and so he was very much a Federalist. And he was a little too Federalist for his own good. He kind of had, I don't want to say he had autocratic instincts, but he definitely had no issue with exerting and using his authority as president in ways that were much more intrusive than a lot of people were comfortable with. And one of the things I read in that book, American Nations, is that the stuff he did as president would not have been out of order in the Northeast of the United States, but that in the rest of the United States, it was definitely too much. And that was one of the reasons why he was so controversial. And that was why Jefferson was kind of a breath of fresh air. He went in the opposite direction and really toned down government interference in the nation's affairs. Yeah, so what was that? Washington. Am I getting this right? Washington, Adams, Jefferson. And then who would have been after that? I'm looking it up. I have to know.
Yeah, Washington to me seems like more so he just wanted to win the war, and that's what he was about, rather than like to be a supreme ruler.
Yeah.
And that, I think, in a way makes someone a better ruler, because they're not doing stuff for selfish means. They have kind of a goal, and then they don't really need to go too far beyond that goal. But yeah, I can definitely see like hero worship and that kind of thing, where you want to put the victor in that seat and you have confidence in them because of the victory and so on.
So after Jefferson was Madison, and then Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there were some anti-federalists here in the early going. Although they kind of changed categories. They became less federalist, anti-federalist, and more homogenized at that. There was a period of American history called the Era of Good Feeling, and it was an era in which there were fewer and less intense partisan affiliations and partisan conflict. And that, I think, is this era here after Jefferson. Mm-hmm. People kind of chilled out a little bit. And then you get into Adams and Jackson. Andrew Jackson, good lord.
He was a loose cannon.
Yeah, he was. Never lost a duel, though. You gotta hand it to him.
Yep.
He had many. People kept insulting his wife.
Yep, and back in the more barbarous times, that would be grounds to fight someone to the death. Nowadays, they just go on stage and slap them once, and then apologize later.
There you go. Yeah, I think my favorite Jackson dueling story was the one where the guy he was dueling actually managed to shoot him first.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of looked down at the wound, looked back at him, and then shot him to death.
Yeah, that hurt, but I'm not dead yet, so I guess I'll keep going. Who else? Yep. Teddy Roosevelt also got shot in the chest.
He did, during a speech he was giving at a rally.
Yep, then he needed to finish the speech like a boss.
Yep, he just shrugged it off and kept going.
His armor class was too high. Yeah, I'm wondering like which of the actual presidents were better or worse, because things get pretty heavily romanticized over time. Teddy Roosevelt is definitely one of the cooler ones. Washington is also one of the ones that gets a lot of praise. I don't know if you've heard Washington, 6'20", fucking killing for fun. Opponents beware, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming.
Never heard that.
You haven't heard that? Can someone in the chat please link that? gosh.
I'm out of touch.
You can tell us all day long about history, but he's a little bit behind on the memes. It's okay. We're here to help.
You know, I was talking with Eche Fatum. What was it, last week, I guess? We were going to try to organize that American Revolution thing. Do you remember that?
Yes. Are we talking
Are you
about...
still up for that?
Yes.
You want to... Is there like a time that would be good for that? We can like organize it or set a time frame or something?
Yeah, if you're up kind of late, basically whenever I work with him, it's like 2 a.m. my time, so it'd be quite late for you.
That's fine.
That's fine.
Yeah, I've been trying to get my schedule off of the... my sleep schedule has been inverted lately, so that's not a problem for me.
What is your sleep wake at the moment?
What is it, like 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., something like that?
That's when you sleep? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we could do it basically at the end of your day then.
Yeah. Now, that said, it's about to be a problem because I have to go to a wedding next weekend.
Uh-huh.
And I'm pretty sure they're not going to have it at like 2 a.m. So I'm going to have some jet lag, basically. Because I don't think I'm going to be able to fix it in just a couple weeks. I've been trying, but it's been a challenge.
Yep. I hear that.
It used to be I would just force myself to wake up at a specific time, you know, regardless of how much I'd slept. But I'm older now, and it doesn't work so well. The body is not so responsive as it used to be.
True. And our healing factor goes down with age as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's set that up. That'll be fun. I kind of forgot about that. We'd been meaning to do it, but it slipped my mind.
Yeah, I could make a group direct message thing. I just need to send you a Discord friend request and invite you both to it, and we can chat there. That usually makes it pretty easy.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Chad did get the Washington video, by the way, as well. You don't need to watch it
thank you,
right
Chad.
now. It's a little bit TOS. It's from the saltier time of the internet a few years ago, back when things were a little bit more crude and unrefined, but it's a very dank video. Kukio definitely watched it.
Yes, the old ways. I remember them.
Yes, the old ways of the internet.
Do kids today even know what a YTMD is?
You're the man now, dog. I don't know, though. Okay, I've got the link for you here. Sending to you in Discord for after.
Thank you.
Yeah. Not sure if you'll learn anything substantive about George Washington, but you'll learn how tales can get taller and taller over time. He'll sub children, but not the British children. Yes. People are saying Jackson killed the bank.
Yeah, the first American central bank that was created. What was that? Did they call it the Bank of America? I always want to call it the Bank of America, but then I think it's actually Bank of the United States. The first Bank of the United States was the first central bank, I believe. First Bank of the... Yeah, that's what it was. So that was created not... Well, 1811? No, defunct 18... Okay, yeah, 1791. So not that long after independence. It took a while to negotiate it, but eventually they were able to create it. And it served as basically the official state-backed banker of the United States government. And it was always controversial. You know, central banks at that time had kind of a bad reputation. There had been a lot of scams. There was what was it? There was a really good video about it on one of those knowledge information YouTube channels. It was about the South Seas crisis. You'd think I would remember it by now. Financial. I'll look it up for you because it's a good watch. South Seas bubble, that's what it was. So that involved one of the first central banks in England And it turned into a huge financial crisis that basically stole money from broad swaths of the public as a way to relieve British debt problems.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a very similar event that happened in France at about the same time. So between the two, central banks not well respected. They were basically seen as agents of corruption, and with ties that were generally run by people with ties that were much too close to people in power to ever really be truly effective or professional. So a lot of the anti-government crowd in the United States, which just as powerful then as it is now, really hated the idea of creating a central bank that would have that kind of power, such that it could be used and abused by people in power in a way that would enhance their power in the United States. And from the perspective of the anti-government crowd, they expected that power to be used against them, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So very controversial for that reason, and they went out of their way to fight against its creation, and then after it was created, they fought very hard to destroy it, and eventually they did. And that ended up not going particularly well, because the War of 1812 started not long after, and without an official central bank, the United States government kind of struggled to fund the war effort. And so that created some difficulties during the war, and after the war, everybody learned from that and said, okay, well, we probably should have a central bank. So then we created the Second Bank of the United States. And that was the central bank for a while, up until Andrew Jackson was elected. And he, of course, was the consummate small government, anti-federalist politician. And so he went out of his way, very far out of his way, to make sure that he destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, which he successfully did, which is what the commentator in question is referring to. Yeah, we didn't have an official central bank again until 1911, something like that, whenever it was that the Federal Reserve was created, basically, very early 20th century. Yeah, between the time that the Second Bank of the United States and the Federal Reserve, between the time that the Second Bank of the United States was dismantled and the creation of the Federal Reserve, the United States basically had a kind of pseudo central bank in the form of private banks that were specifically chosen by the United States government. Whoever was in power at the time basically would choose a bank, and that would sort of be the bank that would act as the government's official banker. So we didn't have an official central bank, but in practice, we kind of sort of did. It was just more of a private affair, which arguably is worse. Certainly in the case of Andrew Jackson, it ended up being worse. Andrew Jackson said, this Second Bank of the United States is just going to be an institution that serves no other purpose than to act as a bludgeon for the elite, to be used against the general population. We have to get rid of it before it is corrupted from the inside out by the power elite. And so then what does he do after it's gone? He just immediately himself cozies up to one of the largest banks in the country. And that relationship itself was tainted by corruption, cronyism, nepotism. And that serves as exactly the tool for Andrew Jackson and his allies that he had warned about with regard to the Second Bank of the United States. So go figure. And then it kind of kept happening after that. I don't know that it was as bad after that than it was under Andrew Jackson, but there were certainly plenty of issues with financial corruption on account of this sort of weird private relationship the United States had between its government and the private banking sector. Yeah, I think it wasn't even until the 1860s with the Civil War that we had a single currency. It might sound weird, but the United States had multiple currencies before that. Any bank could print its own currency. And so we had a number of different currencies, not only between states, but within states. And it created a lot of problems because all of those different currencies had different exchange rates with each other. And it made it very difficult to discern which currency was the more valuable, or really how valuable it was in general. So it was just an inhibitor to trade. It was not really helping with economic development in a sense. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until 1860s that the federal government basically picked out a set of banks that would help it fund the Civil War, and which acted as the principal money printers at the time. They were basically given the power to print money so that they could help fund the U.S. war effort in the 1860s. And that was more or less the same arrangement the U.S. had going forward up until 1911 or so. It was a very incestuous relationship, suffice to say.
Would it be like Texas dollars versus like New York dollars? Would it be state specific, or what did they call them? I didn't even know we had different currencies and stuff early on. But
They wouldn't have called them dollars.
Oh.
They would have called them like banknotes, like Bank of Dallas banknotes versus Bank of Houston banknotes versus Bank of Lexington notes, just whatever banks were there and had enough deposits to be confident enough to print their own money. They would just have their own banknotes, and then people would go out and try to trade with them, and they may or may not be able to, depending on how confident the counterparty was in the currency that they were trying to be paid in. Yeah, it was a very convoluted system, suffice to say. It's very difficult to keep track of all the different currencies and their values because they didn't have the internet, right? With the internet today, we can easily keep track of all of the currencies. We can easily see how they measure up against each other in terms of value and how they change. We can even watch how they change live. You can just be online and watch the markets move the values. But you couldn't do that in the 1800s, right? You pretty much just had to depend on word of mouth, and there's only so much information that could travel only so fast in that method. And so that just inherently made it difficult to keep track of valuations and changes therein.
Yeah, the internet speed back then was approximately one man on a horse speed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's worth mentioning too, and maybe this is a little bit ironic considering the debate over a federal central bank. States actually had their own central banks, and these were much less controversial. The issue with the federal central bank is that the federal government would be able to use that as leverage against the states. But as far as state politics, individuals in states didn't have as much of a problem with state central banks. And that was very common through the 1700s and 1800s. That was one of the main ways that state governments were able to get financing and were able to open up new land. Like if you wanted to borrow money to buy land and settle it, a lot of the time you would be borrowing from the state central bank of the territory you were trying to move to. I think those also issued their own script, their own banknotes, that is. So you actually, to answer your question, you probably would have had like currency for Texas currency, Kentucky currency, whatever, but it would have been explicitly associated with the relevant bank. So like Central Bank of Kentucky or what have you. Yeah, I think they ended up scrapping all of the state central banks later. I'm not quite sure what the history, I'm not quite sure what the specific timeline for that would have been, though. There are some states that still have development banks. I think Montana has like a weird state-backed development bank that still helps the government with some of their financing. Yeah, I remember I first read about that, I was surprised. Montana is such like an anti-government state. It's such a blood-red Republican state. I wouldn't have thought that there would be a big public policy bank like that there, but apparently there is. It's a legacy of the sort of progressive farmers era. That's not what they were called. Populist, there we go. Sort of the populist era of politics in American history in the late 1800s. There was a lot of demand for state support for farmers at that time, especially in rural states. And they ended up creating a lot of support mechanisms, like state interventions, basically, that were designed to help prop up local farmers against the depredations, as they saw it, of bankers and manufacturers. History can swing in strange ways.
True.
Yeah, it may sound counterintuitive, but a lot of the most progressive states in that sense in the late 1800s were Great Plains states. Because I think it was Kansas, or maybe it was Nebraska. It was one of the Great Plains states that was the first state to allow women to vote in state elections. It happened at the state level well before it happened at the national level. But a lot of states didn't do it until relatively late, before the relevant constitutional amendment was passed. But among the few states that did were populist Great Plains states. You wouldn't have expected it, but it's true. Some of that is because some of the people, well, a disproportionate share of the people who lived in the Great Plains states in the late 1800s were relatively recent migrants from Europe, and a lot of them were more idealistic in outlook. They tended to have somewhat more modern sensibilities than some of the other rural folk in the United States at the time. Yeah, the United States was the frontier, well, was the western frontier of Western civilization for a very long time, and some might argue it still is. Kind of debatable. But regardless, for a long time it was relatively undeveloped compared to Europe. We only kind of really caught up sort of early 20th century, probably, maybe late 19th century, depending on how you want to date it. But Kansas leapfrogged them for that reason. Did we have a... Sorry, go on.
We do have a Kansas viewer from the chat. Shout out to JW. He said,
cool.
Kansas used to be very progressive. Now we have Rush Limbaugh and focus on the family.
Well, they've always focused on the family. I don't know that that's new. It's always been pretty... to a degree, conservatism, our perception of conservatism changes not just because people become more conservative, but also because people become relatively more left wing. In the American parlance, we would say relatively more liberal, but that's also a little confusing maybe if you're not from the United States. But in general, urban parts of the United States have moved more to the left, politically speaking, on the broader political spectrum of the United States. Much more, relatively quickly too, over the past 100 years or so. And so as a result, conservative parts of the United States look much more conservative than they did, say, 100 years ago as a result. Urban areas were always more progressive, but the distance between them was not nearly as great as it is now on account of that movement over time in the urban areas. So I don't know that there's really been more conservative. I don't know that rural areas have become more conservative. I'm sure they've become somewhat more conservative, but more likely we just perceive it to become more conservative as urban areas, which probably most of the people listening are from, as urban areas have moved further and further to the left. So there's some perception issues there, basically, I would argue. What did we have other fun stuff that we wanted to get to?
I'm trying to think if there was anything else that jumped out at me from this week. Oh, was there anything else substantive about the Mar-a-Lago papers?
Nothing that I've heard. It's just a lot of legal stuff right now. The Trump team is trying to get what's called a special master.
That sounds it's such a cute name.
We have a little special master here. He's going to look over these papers for you.
Yeah, I was reading that it's apparently not that uncommon. Because apparently there's just a lot of work, a lot of reviewing that has to be done to ensure everybody did everything procedurally correctly, or in a procedurally correct way, rather. And apparently it's not uncommon for a judge to ask for a special master just to kind of sort that out, just to save time. Division of labor, basically.
Well, I heard one of the roadblocks for this whole investigation was the material in question a lot of it is very classified. So you're trying to find someone who can do justice in this situation, but also have clearance to see all of that stuff and what's actually in there, which is pretty tangly to do correctly.
Yeah, it's tough. From what I read, they normally use retired judges to do that, specifically because they're both professional and very experienced, and hence presumably more likely to be able to understand the complexities and deal with them in a time-efficient manner. So I read it anyway. But yeah, the Trump team is probably just trying to buy time, I would expect. I expect they're going to try to draw out the clock as much as they can, to use some sports parlance.
Until what? It seems like...
Well, there's a big event that happens November 2024, isn't there?
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
because if he wins the presidency again, that gives him basically immunity, or at least buys him more
De
time.
de facto immunity, yeah. The only way he could be removed at that point was via impeachment. So if they can drag out the ruling, the court case, then maybe it doesn't matter if he's guilty or not. And there's going to be lots and lots of delays that they're going to be able to implement because, there's going to be lots of disputes and debates about executive privilege, for example. And, none of this has ever been kind of sussed out in a legal setting before because it's unprecedented to have a former president, rather, be in this position. There's never been a case like this. And because it's so unprecedented, there's lots of open questions about how the law applies that have no ready precedent that can be used to really drive home a particular ruling in a quick manner. So all of that is going to get litigated and debated endlessly, for a long time, probably. I would be surprised if there were a quick resolution.
It's an interesting strategy to go about because the information that's there was like very sensitive, should not go out, and it would be like for sure you're in big trouble if you just leave those things laying around, let alone like try to sell them or give other people access to them who don't actually have clearance. So that's a big whoops. But yeah, it's interesting the whole like we don't try our president and to another extent some of our other politicians while they're actively leading in the name of stability, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would be very easy to abuse that if you could kick out a president for legal wrongdoing or something, because it would be easy to create a public impression that wrongdoing had happened or to otherwise misconstrue something that they had done. And then you could just bog down their whole presidency in legal proceedings about whether or not they should be removed for this, that, or the other thing that you think is illegal. So there are different ways to do it, but the way the U.S. system is designed is to give more discretion to the president so that he can conduct the government's affairs unimpeded.
But they didn't
Trade-offs
expect
and all that.
people to see how far they could take this.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that.
No.
You're supposed to sort of color within the lines, respect informal norms that are meant to preserve the stability of the system. But some people don't care about that. Some people want to shoot for the moon and see how much they can get away with. And so that's what we've got.
Don't think we had any questions. Dagnip was asking about the attempted assassination of the vice president of Argentina.
Yeah, I saw that. Actually, I did get his email too. I don't know if he's listening still.
He is.
But I'm just going to need some time to pick through all of it. I'm spending more time procrastinating and preparing for a wedding than I am anything else right now. That's always a perpetual battle. But I will get to it. I'm going to try to pick through it as best I can. But thank you very much for taking the time to respond to all of those questions. And I look forward to some of the other answers that are pending. But yeah, as far as Kirchner, did you see that on Reddit at all?
No.
Oh, I'll send it to you. You can't, well, play it safe, don't watch it on stream, but I'll send it to you for later. But yeah, Kirchner is a powerful political figure in Argentina. She had been president for a pretty good while. Her husband had actually been president before her, and he was president for, what was it, like 5 years, 6 years? I don't remember exactly. Dagnip probably knows. But he died of cancer, I think, while he was in office, and so then she became president to replace him. And then after that, she was in power for a long time, and then eventually her party lost power to, what was it, Macri, I think his name was. And then after that, he was in for 1 term, I think, as president, and then there was another election in which her party did win, but this time she did not lead the government. She was sort of an outsider. I think she does control a ministry or something in the Argentine government. But even though she's not president, she's still probably the most powerful single politician in Argentina right now. You know, the Peronists, well, it's not I can't ever remember any of the party names in Argentina. The only thing I ever remember is Peronists. I'm not Peronist, but it's got to be more complicated than that. But anyway, yeah, her party is basically the Peronist party, and she sort of controls the left wing of the party, roughly, at least as I understand it. And she still wields immense influence. You know, she's easily like the leading figure in the party. So it's no surprise that there was an assassination attempt on her as opposed to the actual president right now of Argentina. And yeah, there's been some protests. From what Dagnip was telling me, they were protests. What was it? Oh, shit, what was it? Basically outside of her house. No, it was between protesters and the government, and then the police got involved, and eventually protesters supporting Kirchner moved to her house and were trying to help her because the police wouldn't let her leave. There's like some convoluted series of events, basically. But at one point, she tried to leave the house, her house, and she was moving through all of these, pro-Kirchner people. And then one of the, well, obviously an anti-Kirchner person kind of moved through the crowd and pulled a gun on her and tried to shoot her in the head. But for whatever reason, the gun actually, it was even dumber than that. It's not that the gun jammed. It's that the gun did not have any bullets loaded. Or at least it didn't have a bullet in the chamber. So when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened.
Oh.
And for whatever reason, he didn't pull the trigger again. You know, I don't know if like somebody jumped on him or if he ran away or what the deal was, but you know, he pulled the trigger once, nothing happened, and then he was just off screen. You couldn't see him.
Mm-hmm.
Destination with him.
He tries to shoot, doesn't happen. Well, this is awkward. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you this one. Where's that from? Another angle. Oh no, this is right. Yep, there it is. It happens really quickly. I don't think, from what I was reading, she didn't even notice it. She actually dropped some. It kind of looks like she recoils from the gun.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I was reading, she actually dropped something and was just basically bending over to pick it up. So I don't think she even saw it.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of other people saw it and were very upset. You can see a bunch of people kind of running at the gunman. Here we go. I'll send you that. But yeah, it doesn't seem to have, well, they did catch the gunman, allegedly. And his girlfriend, actually. They've both been accused of plotting to assassinate her. I think the man, the actual gunman, was linked with some neo-Nazi group or some such.
Mm-hmm.
Although I don't know, that may be exaggerated. It's kind of hard to tell. It seems like it was something they did on their own initiative, not necessarily like a broader conspiracy per se. Mm-hmm. At least given what's known now. You know, who knows what comes out in the future. But for now, it looks like it was just an individual dude who didn't like her. And his girlfriend, apparently. She's kind of cute. I saw her mugshot. Oh, what else did we? I don't think I can add too much to the Argentina stuff. It's very much in flux right now. I think the main focus is still trying to renegotiate. Well, what was it? Is it negotiating the deal or renegotiating the IMF deal? I think they're still negotiating it because I remember there was some kind of delay in which they had to kind of kick the can down the road, basically. They kind of hung up on some of the details. well, that's somebody else entirely. Maybe I was wrong about the mugshot. Well, I'll do more research on that later. Well, anything else catch your eye? I don't have a whole lot, like, in my notes here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff is kind of in a holding pattern right now.
All good. We've got like 20 minutes left, so if you have any silly stories of stuff that's happened.
I actually did have one or two.
Let's go.
Let's see. So did you hear about Maria Adela Kufelt Rivera?
No.
So let's see. She was a woman in Italy, and she had her own business. I think it was like a fashion business of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And she worked specifically in Naples. And she was a real socialite, you know, just attractive young woman, young entrepreneur. And she ran in all the usual circles, you know. And she in particular kind of got to know a lot of officers, because Naples is a big sort of center for NATO as far as being a naval base.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of naval assets that are deployed there, you know, U.S. ships. I think it's actually the center for one of the U.S.'s fleets. Maybe somebody with a better naval background than me would know. But I think that's the case. So basically there's a lot of American naval officers there in particular, but also Italian naval officers and other, you know, officers from other countries as well. So she kind of mixed with them as part of her usual, you know, social activities, so to speak. So anyway, there was a leak, basically, that involved a lot of GRU agents. And if you don't know what the GRU is, that's basically the intelligence agency in Russia that is responsible for foreign intelligence gathering. Now, the FSB handles stuff within, well, actually, it's not even the FSB. I think it's the SVR or something. There are two different intelligence agencies, one that handles domestic affairs within Russia, and then another one that handles affairs outside Russia. And I think GRU is the one that handles the stuff outside of Russia. Chat, please correct me if I'm wrong on that. So that list was leaked, and then immediately after, this woman disappears from Italy, just entirely, and nobody knew what happened to her. And later on, she pops up in Russia. So it turns out, after some investigation, that she was a long-term Russian plant in Naples who had been tasked with spying on NATO officers in Naples and had been doing so for years up until this point.
Ooh.
Deep cover operative, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Very professional. It was very well done. She had a very tragic, interesting backstory. She had been supposedly the child of a Spanish woman, I think it was, who had traveled to Moscow during the Moscow Olympics and who had been abandoned there. And so she was raised in Russia as an orphan. And later on, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, she had moved to Italy in order to start a business and try to move up the social ladder, so to speak. So she had a cool background story. She was very charming, very attractive. She was very popular with the officers and whatnot, as you can imagine. So she was very good at her job, it seems. How much of any of that was actually true? Probably none of it. She was probably just a Russian spy who was trained to go out and observe and gather information. Russian human intelligence is notoriously good. They've always had that as a strength. Not so much with the United States. We tend to struggle with that more.
Human intelligence, meaning like spycraft of having people just as agents?
Yeah, that's gathering information from people or with people. You know, the human side of intelligence gathering, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's human intelligence. The United States is much better at signals intelligence, or electronic intelligence, or, you know, just technical types of intelligence gathering. We tend to excel at that because we tend to have lots of technical experts in the United States who are quite willing and very capable of some very advanced technological shenanigans. that allow us to kind of spy on other people's communications networks. Yeah, I remember one of the sneaky things that happened under the Carter administration back in the 1970s is that there was a submarine that was sent into Soviet waters, obviously submerged. They didn't want to get caught. And what they did is they sent in a special forces team, I think. Or maybe it was just operatives, but regardless, some very highly trained people on the submarine dipped into the water and tapped a line, a communications line. I guess it was a telephone line that was at the bottom of the ocean. It was a submerged oceanic telephone line, basically. And underwater, within Soviet waters, they actually went to it without the Soviets noticing and tapped it. They attached a mechanical device, basically, that recorded communications that traversed that cable. And then based on that, they were able to just very easily observe and listen to conversations between high-ranking naval officers in the Soviet Union's Pacific Fleet. Apparently up to and including a lot of spousal disagreements. Lots of guys arguing with their wives and girlfriends over the phone. That was not an infrequent thing that was heard over the line, apparently. So we're pretty good at that.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that at least. Pretty good if you're trying to surveil the Soviet Union or maybe China. Not so good if you're trying to surveil goat herders in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They don't really use too much technology, so that wasn't as useful. Yeah, one of the things that happened to the CIA over the course of the War on Terror after 2001 is that CIA agents became very paramilitary in nature because they couldn't really do a lot of human. They tried to, but limited success. And they tried to do signals intelligence, but there wasn't a lot of signals to really gather. So the result is that they ended up doing a lot more almost special forces type work, trying to gather what intelligence they could from officers on the ground, or maybe even just regular army personnel on the ground, and then trying to synthesize that with other sources to try to draw a bigger picture, and then use that information to conduct targeted raids and other forms of targeted intelligence gathering. Kind of a mixed bag, but it's what they had to work with. But one of the inadvertent results of that, one of the inadvertent unexpected outcomes of that, is that the nature of the CIA and its agents became relatively more paramilitary in nature, whereas before it had been much more of a sort of traditional spy agency. Tradecraft was much more their thing.
Mm.
And the culture of the CIA reflected that. Now it's a little different, and they're kind of having to shift a little bit. Because now we're shifting away from the war on terror, and we're focusing more on espionage targeting great powers, like Russia and China, and to a lesser degree, Iran. And so that's forcing them to sort of recalibrate for great power conflict rather than dealing with sort of peasant rebels in Afghanistan or Iraq or what have you.
Yeah, it seems like a super risky job. I've seen different spy shows and movies and whatnot, and it's a very low glory, high risk, high skill job to have if you're trying to sneak around and gather intelligence, and if you're like a long-term plant that's ridiculously risky and basically no one's going to celebrate you back home because you're part of the goal is to be like super secretive about who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. It has a
tricky business.
A certain mystique to it, though.
Oh yeah. Do you remember that one deep cover Russian agent, that woman in New York, I think it was, 10 years ago, who got caught? Do you remember her?
No.
Let me see. Russian agent, New York. She had infiltrated the United States in the early 90s, pretty much like end of the Soviet period, or maybe it was early 90s under the Russian Federation. But regardless, she came over, overstayed her visa, created a whole fake identity, and was here for several decades, basically trying to network with various political actors, NGOs, and whatnot, trying to build contacts that she could use in order to gather information and exert influence within American politics. And eventually, I think by accident or because of some counterintelligence operation, the United States was able to identify her, arrest her, and then deport her. Let's see. I think her name was Anna Chapman. That's what it was.
Chapman?
Yeah.
That's a very American-sounding name.
Well, that was her fake name.
Yeah.
It should be American-sounding. Yeah, her real name, according to Wikipedia, was Anna Vasilyevna Kushchenko. There we go.
That's not a very American-sounding name.
No, it is not. Yeah, I sent you the link there. Yeah, there it was. 2010. Russia-U.S. prisoner swap. Yeah, that incident, actually, because she was one of several spies that were caught. It wasn't just her. We actually got a whole gaggle, but she was the most well-known one because she was pretty. She was a pretty young woman, so the media really fixated on her in particular. But that incident actually was the inspiration for that spy show. What was it? The Americans. I think that's what it was called. Have you heard of that?
The spy show what?
The Americans.
The Americans. No, I have not.
Yeah, that was a show about Russian spies in deep cover in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I read, it was more than a little bit dramatized. It was not like necessarily the most historically accurate show. Mm-hmm. But people, when it was out, tended to like it. I read lots of positive reviews and whatnot. I'll send you a thing.
It's got an 8.4.
There you go. But yeah, that show, the creators of that show were partly inspired by that incident.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost knew it would happen too. As soon as I read it, I was like, oh, you know, some smartass is going to try to make a show out of this.
Yep.
We actually did it.
Yeah, Miss Chapman was charged with conspiracy to act as an unlawful agent of a foreign government. That's a pretty high charge. It's a good thing she got swapped. I wonder who we got back for that.
Some of them were dissidents, I think, that the United States asked for, but there was probably a few spies there as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the U.S. government tends to be pretty cagey about that.
Mm-hmm.
We actually just had another prisoner swap just recently, like a couple months ago, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We were trading, who was it? I don't remember who we gave up. I think it was some Russian dude who was caught conducting some kind of espionage. But I remember more specifically that the United States traded to get a Marine in Russia, a U.S. Marine who had been imprisoned in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Who may or may not have been a spy. He says that he wasn't. He's just an innocent dude minding his own business who was arrested for political reasons. But I would note that his background is actually pretty similar to the background of a lot of actual spies. So I'm a little skeptical. Yeah, we do have human intelligence, but it just is not as storied, so to speak, as some of the other human operations conducted by rival spy agencies.
Or they're so good they didn't get caught.
That could be. You know, who's to say? We did turn a few people. We had some high-ranking KGB agents, actually, we were able to turn.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the people responsible were ever caught, at least to my knowledge. Now, somebody in chat mentioned the basketball player. I don't think it was I think she's still in prison. I think the basketball player is still in jail.
Yeah, we're sending over... Who is it? Dennis Rodman. Send Dennis Rodman to go negotiate.
Oh, yeah. Send Dennis Rodman.
We've got Dennis Rodman and you mentioned his name earlier, Steven Seagal. We're bravely going forth and speaking with the despots and the dictators of the world.
Oh, yeah.
When no one else will. We send our weirdest. Yeah, I heard that there was Steven Seagal like going to locations in occupied eastern Ukraine and stuff and just talking next to stuff about the conspiracy theories and the propaganda and basically just backing up whatever their narrative was.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he's been he's been on social media a lot doing that. He's been on Russian TV doing that. We live in the weirdest timeline, Neuro, I'm telling you. Especially if you're old enough like me to remember when he was like a legit action star in Hollywood. I don't know if too many kids remember that, but you could totally go see Steven Seagal in this, that, or the other action movie in the early 90s. And now he's in Russia vouching for Putin for whatever reason. It's just the weirdest damn thing. Yeah, he was always kind of a left-wing guy. Like, he was always associated with left-wing activism. And there was a cohort of the American political left that really went in deep for Russia. Sort of in like the late aughts. That was sort of when everybody was really mad about Iraq in particular. And Russia seemed to be doing better in some ways, seemed to be recovering from the 90s. And there was also a media outlet called Russia Today, which was new at that time. And Russia Today specialized in trying to present stories from a left-wing perspective, which was especially refreshing for people on the left wing in the United States, because they hadn't really had that before. MSNBC had not yet kind of evolved into the left-wing channel, in the United States, sort of like it is now. So there wasn't really the same alternatives. So a lot of people kind of bought into Russia Today and developed an affinity for Russia for that reason. And some people never really grew out of that. Even after, the Crimea drama, Euromaidan and all that, they still kind of clung to Russia as a legitimate government doing legitimate things in Ukraine and whatnot. I think a lot of those people have kind of been broken of that over time, especially given recent events, but some of them are sticklers. Some of them mistrust the US government a lot more than they're willing to mistrust the Russian government, and so they stick by their guns. Some people are still kind of stuck in 2006 in that regard. Steven Seagal seems to be one of them.
Yeah, and also just like trying to find ways to be relevant and different, and that's a way to be different from most of the West, because most of the West, most of the US at this point, at least from what I've heard, would be more in favor of like trying to help Ukrainians defend their sovereignty. And then you've got the Steven Seagals and the Dennis Rodmans who are going against all of the conventional wisdoms and shaking hands with like Kim Jong-un and stuff. It's like you said, the silliest timeline. But I know that Kim Jong-un loves basketball, so he's not going to miss the chance to meet a pro basketball player of the Chicago Bulls. Well, cool. We got a nice bit of U.S. history in today, in addition to some World War II. We looked at the current list of sitting monarchs, which the UK recently just lost the Queen, and now they have King Charles III. I did see that he could have named himself King Arthur, but he chose not to do that. You can take basically any name in your set of names, so you could take your middle name. Like, my middle name is James. I could be King James if I chose to, even though my first name is Austin. So that was a pretty big missed opportunity that we could have had a King Arthur. But there is still hope, because Prince William, who is now the Prince of Wales, also has Arthur in his name. So should he end up with the crown, we could still have a King Arthur. So there's hope for the world.
Here's looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Well, before we go, I would also mention, as one of the big news items was the UK has a new prime minister. Did you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, Liz Truss.
Yes.
Lots of criticism on British Twitter. Some of it pretty hilarious, although very mean-spirited. But yeah, she's going to be the new prime minister going forward. It's not entirely clear just what she wants to do, or even really what she can do, given limitations that Europe is kind of facing right now. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of policy she puts forward, because she has a very large plate of significant policy issues to face. So best of luck to her.
Mm-hmm. True, yeah, that's going to be the more like politically substantive shift in ruling, rather than the monarch who sits upon that throne The throne
I
of
would argue,
symbolism and nostalgia.
yeah, I would argue Liz Truss becoming the new PM is much, much more politically significant in British politics than the death of the Queen.
Mm-hmm.
Easily.
Well,
But yeah, I
cool.
just wanted to kind of get to that real quick, sneak that in at the end.
Heck yeah. Well, I challenge you to the regular 20-minute walk thing, and I will, before I forget, just create a group DM with you, me, and Eche Fatum, so we can coordinate a time for some American Revolution, the philosophy of it, and the history of it, and how those two things coincide. That sounds like a really fun conversation. We've never actually had the three in one place at one time, Neuro, Eche Fatum, and Agent Smith, but the Discord conversation has begun.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today.
I did do the walk.
Oh, you did?
Last week. I did do the walk last week, and I actually got caught in a rainstorm.
Yeah, people who don't know Texas weather, sometimes it abruptly comes down in a bucket. Is that what happened?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I was on the final circuit. I do 3 circuits around the house, and that generally gets me to the time limit I need.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on the 3rd circuit, and I was like, it's starting to sprinkle. Not too bad. I'll just keep going. I'll finish.
Mm-hmm.
And then I made it about halfway, and then just whoosh, just all of the water comes down out of the sky.
Nice.
And it's windy and it's stormy. I almost lost my hat. Like, the only reason I still have my hat is because the neighbor has a really tall fence. And it just happened to catch it.
Nice.
And I had to walk through that for like 5-6 minutes back to the house.
What a baller. You get an extra gold star for that walk. That's the thing about like inconvenient stuff that happens is like if it's mildly inconvenient, then it just sucks. But if it's like pretty messed up and pretty annoying, then at least you get a story out of it. So you got a Texas weather story to share with us for your walk this week.
Oh, yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, I was hoping it would just be like a refreshing light rain that would be fun to walk in. But that's not what I got.
No.
I was a little worried I would get struck by lightning. It was kind of that bad.
You got the fury of the gods.
Oh, yeah. Made it back in time, though, so all was good.
Well, very good, sir. Chat, thank you for tuning in for this episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. If you missed some or all of it, it'll be on YouTube. And if you have any scathing comments or reviews to leave in the comments, don't hesitate to do so. And we will see you next week for World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Talk to you next time. Thanks again. Always a privilege.
GG. And that's a video.